At 7:29 a.m., the world held its breath. 1 minute later, hell opened its gates. On July 1st, 1916, over 100,000 men charged across open fields under the summer sky. By nightfall, more than 57,000 were dead or wounded. It was the bloodiest day in British military history, and it was only the beginning. This is not just a battle. This is a story of ambition, horror, and unimaginable loss. A battlefield where the earth itself seemed to scream. This is the Battle of the Somme. Chapter 1: A World at War. The world was already drowning in blood. In the summer of 1914, a spark ignited that would quickly turn into an inferno, one that consumed continents, shattered empires, and changed the course of history forever. Nobody could have imagined the scale of the disaster that was about to unfold. What began as a brief, decisive conflict soon became a grinding nightmare that would drag on for years, drowning millions in mud, fire, and sorrow. By 1916, Europe was scarred beyond recognition. The Western Front stretched like a jagged wound across the continent, a battlefield hundreds of miles long, carved deep into the earth itself. It was a place where human life was measured in inches, where trenches and barbed wire ruled the landscape, and where death waited in every shadow. Soldiers lived like rats in cramped, flooded trenches, breathing in the stench of decay and waiting for the next storm of bullets and shells. The relentless rain turned the battlefield into a quagmire, swallowing men and machines alike. Every step forward meant certain danger. The earth itself seemed to resist. For nearly 2 years, armies faced each other, locked in a deadly stalemate. Neither side could force the other back. It was as if two enormous, unforgiving forces were locked in a frozen embrace, clawing at the soil, refusing to give ground. The war was no longer about swift charges or heroic victories. It was a slow, grinding battle of attrition, wearing down men, machines, and spirits until nothing was left. But how did it come to this? How did the world become trapped in this endless cycle of violence, mud, and despair? The answers lie deep in the tangled web of politics, alliances, and ambition that bound the great powers together. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in a small Balkan city lit the fuse of a powder keg. One after another, nations declared war, each driven by promises to protect allies, to defend honor, or to seize advantage in a world on the brink. On one side stood Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, a coalition determined to reshape the balance of power. On the other stood Britain, France, Russia, and their allies, each convinced their cause was just, their soldiers brave, their victory inevitable. The early days of the war were filled with hope and expectation. Battles fought with charge and countercharge, movements sweeping across fields and forests. But soon, the brutal reality of new technology shattered those illusions. Machine guns that could fire hundreds of bullets per minute, massive artillery shells that turned earth to glass, poisonous gases that choked and blinded. These weapons made traditional warfare a suicide mission. Trenches became the grim solution, deep, narrow ditches where soldiers could shelter from the storm of fire. They were cold, muddy, and filled with rats, lice, and disease. Men lived for months in these hellish conditions, fighting not just the enemy, but exhaustion, fear, and the slow erosion of hope. By 1916, the war had drained nations of resources and resolve. The endless stalemate was breaking the spirit of soldiers and civilians alike. Desperation grew on both sides, and with it, the hope for a breakthrough, one decisive strike that could end the horror. The Western Front was the heart of this desperate struggle. Whoever could break its deadlock could rewrite the fate of the war, and perhaps the world. And so, the stage was set for one of the most massive and deadly battles ever seen, the Battle of the Somme. But what did that mean for the soldiers who would march into that inferno? For the families waiting anxiously at home? For entire nations hoping for an end to the nightmare? The answers would be written in blood and mud, under skies filled with smoke and fire, with cries of bravery and despair echoing across the blasted fields of northern France. As the world prepared for what many hoped would be the war's final, decisive blow, a shadow hung heavy over the plans. The generals believed they had mastered modern warfare. They placed their faith in enormous artillery barges that they thought could crush the enemy's defenses to dust. They imagined their soldiers could then walk calmly across no man's land, facing little resistance. But war, as it always does, proved to be a harsh and unforgiving teacher. In that brutal lesson, thousands would pay with their lives. The Battle of the Somme would become a symbol of courage and sacrifice, of tragedy and futility, a war that would reshape how humanity understood conflict itself. And it was only just beginning. Chapter 2. Planning the Impossible. The ground shook for 7 straight days. Over 1.5 million shells screamed through the skies and slammed into the German lines. The roar never stopped. It was thunder without pause, fire without breath. The British command believed nothing could survive such a storm. When the shelling finally ceased at exactly 7:30 in the morning, July 1st, 1916, they were certain the way had been cleared. But beneath the torn-up earth and shattered trenches, the German soldiers were still there, waiting, alive, and ready. That disaster was no accident. It was the outcome of decisions made months earlier in quiet rooms by men in polished boots and heavy coats. Maps were spread out across oak tables. Lines were drawn. Arrows etched in ink. Plans were crafted with care and confidence. This chapter begins there, with the planning of a battle meant to end the war. It was late 1915, and the Western Front had frozen into stalemate. Britain and France had been locked in brutal struggle with Germany for over a year. Thousands were dying every week, and the war showed no sign of ending. French forces were growing weary, and Britain, new to large-scale warfare on European soil, was under pressure to take on more of the burden. General Sir Douglas Haig, recently appointed commander of the British Expeditionary Force, believed he had the answer. Tall, reserved, and precise, Haig carried himself with a sense of duty that bordered on stubbornness. He believed in discipline, in resolve, and above all, in the power of artillery. Like many of his generation, he had been trained in the tactics of earlier wars, where massed troops and firepower could break the enemy. He believed that overwhelming force, applied correctly, would destroy the German defenses. And so, when the French commander, General Joffre, asked the British to lead an offensive along the river Somme to relieve pressure on Verdun, Haig accepted. Not just as a favor, but as an opportunity. An opportunity to prove the strength of the British Army. An opportunity to break through the German lines. An opportunity to win the war. It would be the largest British offensive to date. A test not only of military strength, but of planning, timing, and sheer willpower. The Somme sector was chosen because it lay along the boundary between the French and British forces. The land there was open, rolling, and, at least on paper, well suited for an assault. But there was a problem. The Germans had occupied this ground for nearly 2 years. Their defenses were deep, layered, hardened. Their frontline trenches were reinforced with concrete. Barbed wire was strung in rows, sometimes 30 yards thick. Behind the lines were dugouts, shelters carved into the earth, sometimes 40 feet deep, where troops could wait out even the heaviest bombardments. None of this was truly unknown to the British. But there was a confidence, a dangerous confidence, that their artillery could crush it all. The plan was simple in theory. In practice, it was a gamble. Haig and his artillery commander, General Henry Horne, believed that with enough shells, fired over enough time, they could obliterate the German front. They gathered over 1,400 field guns and heavy artillery pieces. For 7 days, these guns would rain destruction on the German lines. It would be a storm of steel, loud, unrelenting, and total. The belief was that once the shelling ended, the German barbed wire would be shredded, their trenches flattened, their morale broken. British infantry would then go over the top, climb out of their own trenches and walk across no man's land to occupy the ruins. Walk, not run, because the plan assumed there would be no one left to resist. Haig insisted on this point. His men were to advance in waves. shoulder to shoulder, with rifles at the ready. Not a chaotic charge, but a measured, steady push. Discipline was to be maintained. Order was to be kept. And yet, even as the plans took shape, doubts whispered behind closed doors. Some officers warned that the barbed wire could not be destroyed so easily, that the German dugouts were too deep, that the element of surprise, so vital in war, was being sacrificed for spectacle. Still, the preparations continued. Over 1 million shells were stockpiled. Hundreds of thousands of men were trained, equipped, and moved into position. Tunnels were dug beneath the German lines, filled with explosives that would be detonated just before the attack. The scale was unprecedented. It was, in every sense, industrial warfare. But there was something else. Something not on the maps, not on the plans. The human cost. Many of the British units preparing for the assault were made up of PALS battalions, groups of friends, neighbors, and co-workers who had enlisted together. These were young men from the same villages, the same factories, the same schoolyards. They had joined with pride and patriotism, believing they would serve beside familiar faces. No one had told them what it truly meant. They drilled. They marched. They wrote letters home. They whispered jokes to keep away the fear. Most had never seen battle. They were told the artillery would do the hard work, that the German defenses would be shattered, that the Somme would be a turning point. And perhaps, in a way, it would be. As June turned into July, the artillery began. The roar echoed across the countryside, day and night, without pause. Birds fled. Animals vanished. The very ground trembled. Soldiers in the trenches covered their ears. Some wept from exhaustion. Others stared silently at the horizon. On the German side, the shelling was terrifying, but not fatal. Many shells were faulty. Some exploded too early. Others buried themselves in the mud and failed to detonate. The barbed wire, in many places, remained intact. And in the deep dugouts, German troops waited. They knew an attack was coming. The constant shelling had given it away. They checked their weapons, repaired their machine guns, marked the enemy lines. And when, finally, the bombardment ceased, on the morning of July 1st, 1916, they climbed from the depths, ready. Back on the British side, whistles blew. Men rose from their trenches. In wave after wave, they stepped forward. They walked straight into fire. But that moment, those first minutes of July 1st, belonged to a future chapter. A chapter written in blood. For now, in this moment of quiet before the storm, the British commanders believed they had done all they could. That their plan, crafted with care, backed by logic, and fueled by steel, would succeed. They believed in the supremacy of artillery, in the righteousness of their cause, in the inevitability of victory. But war does not reward belief. It exposes it. And as the soldiers took their places, rifles in hand, hearts pounding, eyes fixed on the horizon, a grim truth lingered, one the generals could not see from their maps and reports. The enemy was not broken, and the greatest storm was yet to come. Chapter 3. Verdun bleeds. The cries echoed through stone corridors. Men screamed from pain. Caps were tossed in agony. The fortress of Verdun held, but its soul was bleeding. In February of 1916, the Germans unleashed a storm. They struck Verdun, not because it was grand, but because it mattered. It was French. It was strong. And they believed, deep in their cold hearts, that by breaking it, they would break France's will. The bombardment began with 184 heavy guns churning the skies. Day after day, shells fell like falling stars set aflame, ripping through earth and steel. The ground shook. Buildings collapsed. Trenches vanished into craters. Every day was February 1st turned to hell. The French defenders were worn. They fought as if drowning, gasping for air under wave after wave of steel. They filled their pockets with medals, prayers, and letters to loved ones. They cursed the enemy and the war. And yet, they held on. The German hope was simple. Wear France down. Make Verdun a symbol of pain. And force the French to pour all their strength here, leaving other fronts weak, vulnerable. It worked. By early spring, Verdun was bleeding French forces dry. They could barely send more men. Shells were running low. Their backs were against the wall. France's generals knew Their army would collapse without help. In the grand war rooms of Paris and Tours, decisions were made. The French commander, General Joffre, sent up the alarm. They had to relieve Verdun, or it would die. But how? The guns at Verdun were growing silent in some places, but the men, no, never silent. Worse, Germany would follow with another blow. France needed relief. An ally. A distraction. Enter Hague. Enter the British. Those polished uniforms and calculated accents. This was their chance. The British would strike, somewhere else, to pull German eyes, guns, men, away from Verdun. The River Somme became that place. A long, muddy scar on the map. Not sacred, not symbolic, but painful in its own right. In Paris, generals looked at maps and at the faces of their soldiers and made their plea. Hit them at the Somme. It was no idle request. It was a demand born of desperation. They wrote letters. They sent messengers. They appealed to honor, to debt, to shared blood. But the British had their own doubts. They were still mastering the art of modern war. They worried, was this timing right? Was their shell supply enough? Were their men trained? Could they shift their entire army, quietly, without Germany noticing? Haig reassured them. We will hit them hard. We can draw away their divisions from Verdun. We can give the French breathing room. He pressed the words with calm assurance, lips tight, chin firm, eyes on the flicker of the candles in the planning room. The somber hush of that room was broken by maps, lines drawn in chalk, arrows marking attacks, circles showing French relief columns, stars where artillery would sit. It was careful. It was cold. But behind it all was hope. Or perhaps, fear disguised as determination. Germany heard it too. They had spies. They counted British shell factories. They watched troop movements. They sensed the plan, but they did not speak. In the mud of the trenches, French soldiers and British soldiers, though miles apart, prayed with the same hands. They wheezed under the same cold sky. Neither could see Verdun from their trenches. But both knew it was there. And both hoped this new battle would give Verdun life, and give them a chance to survive. Hidden beneath the solemn nods and stiff salutes, the concern weighed on Haig and Joffre. They knew they were playing with lives. They had to make the Somme enough of a storm to drown German attention, but not so massive that it drowned their own forces. The clock kept ticking. Verdun's cannons still boomed. Men were still dying in the silence between shells. The war was pushing France to its limits. The British had promised relief. Now the battlefield at the Somme was being shaped in that promise. Shells were stockpiled, bridges reconstructed, trains packed. Units moved in the night, away from enemy eyes. Engineers labored. Sappers dug. Commanders stared at the maps until their fingers trembled over the chalk lines, tracing the future path of men and steel. Yet, even in those hurried moves, a heaviness gripped Haig's heart. He thought of the PALS battalions, school friends, workmates, neighbors, marching now toward the Somme under false dawn skies. He thought of Verdun defiant still, its walls bruised, but unbroken. He thought of the men that would fill the night with their dying. And still, he believed. The British offensive at the Somme would begin with fireworks, massive explosions underground to startle the enemy. Then with 834 guns roaring across the landscape. Then with men marching across the mud, shoulder to shoulder, walking toward fate. The Somme would bleed Germany, but could it bleed enough to save Verdun? The answer would come in the shell-shattered fields of July. But for now, in those quiet hours before battle, the great gamble was made. The scales tilted. The pieces were set. The German cannons boomed at Verdun. The British trains rolled toward the Somme. And the French, exhausted, hopeful, trembling, waited. In that uncertain silence, a single question hovered in the minds of all who planned, all who prayed. Would the Somme be salvation, or their final, fatal mistake? And then, the guns would speak. Chapter 4. Men for the slaughter. They marched in straight rows, faces clean-shaven, uniforms crisp, flags snapping in the spring breeze. Yet none were hardened by war. They were boys in men's bodies, full of longing and pride, tapped on the shoulder by history. When Lord Kitchener's call echoed across Britain, "Your country needs you," An entire generation answered. They were called the Pals Battalions, young men from the same villages, the same factories, the same schoolrooms, enlisting as friends, promising to serve together, to survive together. They believed in heroism, a myth, really, but one woven by families and newspapers and the pride of a nation that had not yet tasted trenches. At the training grounds, they learned to march, to load rifles, to salute. They practiced drill, the military's slow dance, a mirrored motion of discipline and unity. But no drill could prepare them for the real war. Drill taught form. It did not teach fear. Yet, beneath their bright eyes, some trembled. A letter home said, "We all feel fine, full of cheer, but at night, I lie in my bunk and wonder." The sentence stopped. He could not finish. The camps buzzed with laughter by day. Drums boomed. Bands played martial tunes. But when the sun dropped low, the camp turned quiet. Young men stared into embers. The shadows lengthened. In the glow, their faces looked older, altered by something they could not name. They swapped stories about sports, sweethearts, hometown pubs. They joked that the war would be over by Christmas. It was a hope everyone shared, but few believed. Still, illusions kept them smiling. Officers taught them bayonet thrust. The bayonet, a steel knife fixed to the rifle, meant a soldier didn't just shoot. He plunged. It was intimate. It was brutal. The trainees practiced on straw dummies. No one spoke of the real thing. Soon, letters from home arrived. Mothers wrote of worries. Sisters urged caution. Fathers reminded them of their duty. Each man replied, "Don't worry. We'll show them what Britain is made of." It was both promise and shield. Among the battalion was Thomas, from Lancashire, a blacksmith's son with shoulders broad as gates. He carved tiny wooden pipes in his bunker, each one for his brother, if he made it home. He smiled at the other young men. He laughed loudest at their jokes. But at night, he traced each pipe, imagining wind in its hollow. Across the camp was Samuel, a school teacher before the war. He read from Shakespeare in quiet moments. His voice trembled when he read about Macbeth's guilt. He told himself, "Our stage will be different." But the lines haunted him. The biggest test came when the Red Cross set up a makeshift field hospital near the camp. One evening, the wounded arrived, shrapnel wound to the arm, leg amputated. Blood leaked through bandages, faces contorted by pain. The trainees watched in silence. Some turned away. Some wept. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned. The cries visited him. Not the cry of guns, but of men he might soon know, not as a rumor, but as flesh and blood. He lay in the dark and wondered, "Will I stay whole?" Samuel sat outside his tent. He adjusted his cap. He thought of his friends. Will I be the one returning to teach, or returning in a box? The next morning, the camp was different. The laughter stayed, but quieter. The walk to breakfast was slower. The rifles were heavier. They trained harder. They learned trench digging, scooping muddy earth with shovels. They learned trench echo, how your voice carried, if you called a name. They learned camouflage, how to blend into the landscape. The lessons were practical. They were brutal. Each day chipped away innocence. Majors spoke of tomorrow. They said, "Soon, you will see the Somme. Soon, you will know what war truly is." They meant to prepare them, but some simply stiffened. Others steeled themselves. The trainees made paper cranes, each one a wish to come home. They pinned them to their uniforms. They wrote names, Mary, Elizabeth, John. Then they tucked the cranes inside their tunics. A week before departure, troops gathered for one last parade. The brass band struck up a hymn. Mothers and sisters and sweethearts watched, tears glistening. The men stood to attention, their feet proud, their chins high. Some lips quivered. Some fists clenched the uniform, as though holding on to something dear. Thomas saw his mother's shawl tremble. He dared not look. Samuel caught his reflection in a polished rifle barrel. He saw a boy holding a man's weight. He blinked and tightened his jaw. Orders came that night. Move out at dawn. They filed onto trains, gear slung over shoulders. The mist curled around wheels. "Here we go," someone whispered, but no one replied. They stared ahead, into the journey. They arrived near the Somme months later, muddy fields, scarred roads, blood-soaked trenches waiting. The air stank of churned earth. Their boots sank into ooze. They saw men from other units, men already changed, hollow-eyed, silent. Training was one thing. Reality was another. The rifles still felt heavy. The mud came to their knees. The worst was the waiting. Waiting for orders. Waiting for shelling. Waiting to go over the top into no man's land. The space between trenches where death moved with no face. One afternoon, they were ordered to climb into a troop trench. The waiting began again. Shells thudded in the distance. The men looked at each other. Some held their wooden cranes tight. Some stared at the clay walls, tracing cracks. Each breath felt loud. They counted seconds. They wondered, how long can this go on? They were men of hopes and fears. They were sons, brothers, friends. They were volunteers, but they were not invincible. As the sun began to slip behind clouds, the order came. Tomorrow, the advance. The officers repeated the plan. Artillery barrage, mines explode. Then they walk across to take the German line. Just walk, they said. Their hearts felt heavier than their packs. Thomas tucked his wooden pipe inside his shirt, one final time. Samuel buried his paper crane under his tongue. They both closed their eyes, praying for dawn. They were untried, unbroken, but ready. And as night embraced the Somme, they waited. Waiting for the whistle. Waiting for the earth to shake. Waiting to become part of something larger, something terrible. In the hush of that night, the greatest test of their lives drew near. Tomorrow, they would learn what it truly meant to be men, and what it truly cost to be brave. And the Somme waited. Chapter 5. Into the trenches. A shell exploded inches away. The trench wall splintered, spraying mud and wood. A man's scream ripped through the air, cut off in a heartbeat. This was no battlefield spectacle. This was everyday life. Welcome to life in the trenches. By the summer of 1916, the front lines along the Somme had become a grotesque labyrinth of dugouts, firing rises, and narrow pathways etched into the earth. These trenches, built by hand, were the stage upon which men would live, suffer, and face their deepest fears. Imagine standing in a tunnel carved into the earth. Overhead, sodden logs strain under the weight of mud. Water seeps through cracks, filling your boots. Every step squelches. Your world narrows to this passage. You breathe in a stench of wet wool, sweat, and decay. The smell of humanity under pressure. Rats, the size of small cats, scuttle by. They feast on scraps, and worse. They gnaw at bandages, teeth filled with disease. Men called them trench rats. They became both foe and reminder. Nothing in war respects you. Disease lurked, too. Trench foot, a slow death of the flesh, crept through soaked socks. Feet turned blue. Infected skin peeled back like lifeless cloth. Soldiers wrapped feet in whale oil, but mud always returned. Lice crawled in furrows of wet socks and dirty collars, itching and burrowing. The soldiers scratched until they bled. There was no cure. Every dawn, men crawled from their dugouts to stand on firing rises. These were small earthen platforms just above the trench lip, places where you looked out toward the enemy. You could see no man's land, a shattered zone of tree stumps, shell holes, and wire fences twisted into nightmares. Over it all, the sky was a heavy gray, containing rain, or worse, a shell. Each man wore a steel helmet, riveted and battered. It protected against shrapnel, but could not shield memory. Faces were drawn tight, eyes haunted by what they had seen and by what they expected to see. Conversations were often reduced to whispers. Talk of home, sometimes a luxury. A name, Mary or John, could bring a tremor of warmth. But talk of tomorrow was dangerous. Tomorrow held a whistle. Tomorrow held orders. Tomorrow might hold death. Food arrived in rations, tins of bully beef, hard biscuits, sometimes jam. Hot tea was rare. Most drank cold water from muddy pumps. Men joked it tasted like the trenches themselves. One soldier, George, a baker's son from Yorkshire, clutched his tin of corned beef like it was gold. Each bite was a gift. His hands shook. He chewed slowly, communing with memories of his mother's pies. He read letters home by lamplight and imagined faces smiling back. Another, Ahmed, a British colonial volunteer from India, stared at a muddy puddle and saw fields from home, a golden stretch of mustard. He wondered if he would return. He had learned the names of European birds, sparrow, lark, but their songs seemed hollow now. He missed the sound of his mother humming in twilight. Their jobs in the trenches were simple, but deadly. Sentries kept watch. They listened for movement. Every whisper counted. A cough in the darkness. A footstep on loose earth. They signaled with a flick of light or a tap and waited for confirmation. One mistake meant shells, or bullets, or discoordinated rifle fire. Night brought no comfort. The darkness made everything worse. Every noise sounded like an incoming enemy. The wind whispered against corrugated iron roofs. Rats gnawed in the rafters. The men huddled in makeshift dugouts, sometimes no larger than a grave. They lay on straw, hoping it would keep out the cold. Their breath fogged overhead. Sleep was broken, burned by nightmares. Some dreamt of swimming in rivers, some of fields of wheat. Most woke screaming. Their mates slapped them to life. Another shell fell. Another silence followed. Another heartbeat. Letters from home were a lifeline. The few words of hope could carry a man through a week of horror. Postcards showed sunlit gardens. Mothers wrote of hope. Sisters sent pressed flowers. Each letter arrived damp, stained with mud, wine, or rain. But they were treasure and burden. Each letter reminded a man of love and of what he would leave behind. Corporal Davies, who had once taught in a schoolroom, read a letter from his wife. She spoke of watching their little girl skip on garden paths, a world he could no longer touch. His eyes blurred. He pressed the letter to his uniform and whispered, "I will come back." But already, he felt different. His heart was heavier. His laughter hollow. Time in the trenches stretched and folded. Days and nights bled into each other. The calendar meant nothing. A man might serve weeks or months. Relief came in rotations, but often it was a quieter horror. Trenches moved closer. Shelling intensified. Relief meant facing fresh mud, fresh terror. In those rotations, soldiers learned survival. They patched sandbags. They rebuilt trenches. They learned what shrapnel did. They sought camaraderie as armor. They shared food, cigarettes, quiet moments of memory. 3 soldiers, James, Ahmed, and George, formed a small trio. They shared rations. They prayed together. They laughed when they could. In the silence after shelling, they smiled. Sometimes George played a tin whistle he found. They hummed old tunes. They said simple things. We are here together. But none were naive. Each knew the day of the great barrage approached. Each wondered if their boots would carry them over the top. Each feared that laughter might be the last they ever shared. As the trenches filled with the sound of distant guns, the men held their breath. They checked their rifles, cleaned their bayonets, adjusted their packs filled with extra ammunition, grenades, and a loaf of bread each. They talked of home. They talked of bad coffee and better beds. They talked of life before mud swallowed their feet. In the middle of a quiet afternoon, a whistle sounded. A low, distant note. They froze. It was not the whistle of everyday orders. It was different, lower, measured. They ceased talking. They looked at each other. Was it the final drill? The final warning? Or something else? Behind them, Corporal Davies' eyes flickered. His heart pounded. He swallowed. He whispered, "They're doing it." James gripped Ahmed's shoulder. He squeezed. Ahmed nodded. George swallowed hard. Each of them felt the walls shift. The earth tremble. It was the sound they had been waiting for and dreading. Because once that whistle sounded, they would climb out into no man's land. And life as they knew it would end. A new chapter would begin, and these trenches would bear their last names. But first, they had to cross the lip of the trench and step into the unknown. Chapter 6. The Whistle That Changed Everything. A thunderous roar, instant, brutal. A whistle shrilled through the haze. Then silence, so vast it swallowed every heartbeat. July the 1st, 1916. The day the Somme changed forever. At 0730, the whistle echoed across the battered earth. Soldiers froze. Hearts leapt. They gripped rifles, tightened boots, straightened shoulders. Then, they climbed up and out. In an instant, The fields exploded into chaos. Machine guns spat bullets like angry wasps. Artillery fire hammered every inch of ground. Above them, shells screamed, then slammed into flesh and mud. The ground shook, throwing men to their knees. Smoke, dust, and cries rose together into a new kind of hell. The plan was simple. After 7 days of heavy bombardment, the barbed wire would be shredded. Trenches flattened. They would walk forward, shoulder to shoulder. Discipline would win. Courage would finish the job. But it failed. The wire stood tall, twisted and sharp. Men lunged and fell, caught, hung. They struggled, panicked. Germans peered from dugouts, pulled levers, and opened fire. Machine guns roared in deadly flurries. Rifle volleys followed. The dead fell in lines no human was meant to stand. Minute 1. Whisper quiet crossed no man's land. Until that whistle. Then a storm of violence. The first wave charged. Within seconds, hundreds dropped, gasping, bodies crumpled. Minute 5. Survivors reached the wire. Some dove into craters. Some ran back. Some crawled forward, hoping, terrified. Minute 10. Shells replaced whistling silence. Artillery from both sides joined the scream. Trench mortars lobbed bombs, short, ugly booms. For the men, time stopped and rushed at once. Seconds were years. Minutes were eternities. The field was a living nightmare of noise and blood. Thomas, from Lancashire, was among the first wave. He saw his friend, George, reel and collapse. He froze. For a heartbeat, he felt guilt. Then instinct drove him. He pulled George back. He dragged him into a crater. He swallowed tears as he saw George's vision blur. And he heard the whistle, again. Samuel, the school teacher, wore a look of resolve. He climbed over the parapet, rifle raised. Machine gun fire cut, swathes beside him. He froze, then stumbled, then fell. He lay face down in mud, closed his eyes, and prayed for a breath that did not come. Meanwhile, deeper in the lines, other battalions moved. They moved slowly, pipes in pockets, letters clutched, eyes fixed forward with hope and fear. Many never knew what hit them. Many never saw an enemy face. They just collapsed or got swallowed by the ground beneath layers of earth ripped wide by shells. Hour by hour, the field filled with bodies and broken weapons and torn uniforms. Canteens, letters, photos, mementos of home. Some kept falling. Some lifted themselves and ran again. Some screamed. Some went silent forever. By 11 o'clock, 10,000 men were casualties. Men on both sides pulled the wounded away. Some begged for water. Some begged for their mothers. Some begged silence. The afternoon carried on with the same horror. Companies tried to regroup. Officers shouted orders. Men tried to obey, but the earth seemed alive, pushing them down with explosions, shaking them from their souls with thunderous bombs. Thomas found a slim chance, a small rise in the earth. He pulled George there, pressed a clean cloth to his wound, whispered comfort. George looked at him and nodded before closing his eyes. Thomas kissed his cheek, prayed, then moved again, because waiting meant death. Samuel's body was found later by stretcher bearers. They carried him through mud to a field hospital. Doctors rushed in. They shouted amputate, blood loss, shock. His letter home lay blood-stained in his pocket. As evening fell, the bombardment paused. The screams dimmed into echoes. The moon rose over craters glittering like dark, broken jewels. Rats began to creep from the wreckage. Shell holes filled with water. Silence claimed the broken field. At night, some men listened for the expected German counterattack. Others whispered farewell letters home under candles. Nurses wrote names on arms, on crosses, on solace-laden scraps. It was the bloodiest day in British military history. 57,000 troops killed or wounded. 20,000 never saw another dawn. Families at home received telegrams in pale rooms. Mothers collapsed. Sisters wept. A country was stunned into grief. And yet, with the night came a new dread. Was this only the beginning? In the distant trenches, the German line held. Their losses were fewer, but still painful. Their defenders prepared for British advances tomorrow. Their voices whispered in bunkers, "They will come again. We must stand." On the Somme, Survivors lay cold, frozen, or bleeding. The living wept for the fallen. The dead lay in rows, silent testimony to a plan gone wrong. At dawn, the field became a graveyard. Volunteers counted bodies. Officers scattered crosses and markers. They walked broken ground. They searched for men missing, for heroes buried in mud, for hope and hopelessness. Orders still stood. The offensive was to continue, for days, weeks, months. The whistle that had begun the massacre would sound again. The earth would scream again. The world had entered a new age of war, one without mercy. Thomas, wounded in the leg, was carried back to a dressing station. He coughed blood. He whispered George's name. He closed his eyes. Samuel's mother received the telegram at dawn. Her hands shook. She touched his picture again and again. She whispered, "My boy." Tomorrow, the whistle would blow again. But tonight, two nations counted their dead and prayed for quieter dawns. At the end of this night, a question lingered in every heart. Was bravery enough? The Somme had begun, and the whistle's echo would follow them forever. Chapter 7. Why the bombardment failed. The earth shook with agony. 1.5 million shells rained down over 7 relentless days. The roar was endless. When the dust cleared, German defenses stood intact. The bombardment had failed. In the week before July 1, 1916, British artillery unleashed what was claimed to be the most devastating barrage yet. Over 1,400 guns fired torrents of shells. Some accounts say nearly 1.7 million rounds, aimed at smashing trenches, ripping barbed wire, and obliterating enemy infantry shelters. Generals believed the Germans would be so shattered they would vanish. Troops in British trenches called it a storm of iron. Private James Weaver described the noise as a beast with 1,000 mouths. Yet inside German bunkers, men sheltered deep underground, safe from the fury above. Haig and Rawlinson believed their artillery would punch through, and that infantry could then walk across no man's land behind a creeping wave of fire, quickly seizing German lines. But the guns were too thinly spread. Though millions of shells fell, many were shrapnel, best suited to scatter steel balls across open fields, not to destroy deep concrete dugouts or cut thick wire entanglements. At the same time, roughly 30% of all shells failed to explode. Faulty fuses and chalky soil absorbed impact without detonation, leaving wire upright, trenches intact, and ammunition worthless. German barbed wire remained, sometimes as deep as 30 yards, snaring advancing troops into death zones. German defenders, meanwhile, endured. Deep bunkers, some 40 feet underground, lined beneath trenches acted like buried fortresses. Inside, men huddled in near silence, waiting. Most suffered little harm. When shelling ended, they climbed out, man-machine guns and bolt rifles, calm and ready. British infantry, expecting shattered defenses, climbed out of trenches to face wires still standing, trenches full, and Germans alert. Machine guns roared across open fields. Soldiers fell by the hundreds. Lieutenant Henry Clark watched at dawn. The wire stood firm. A scout staggered toward him. "Uncut, sir." Men trapped. Clark felt his stomach twist. The plan seemed powerless. Planners had hoped that artillery density and timing would work like a moving shield, a creeping barrage that advanced ahead of infantry to suppress defenders. In practice, miscommunication and timing issues meant soldiers fell behind the barrage, sacrificing its protective effect. British procedure lacked flexibility. Junior officers could not call back fire to neutralize unexpected strongpoints. Telephone lines lay in ruins. Runners across no man's land were shot down. The artillery lacked forward observers near the infantry, so the guns could not adjust when resistance held. German defenders had superior communication systems. Their buried telephone lines and observation posts directed counter-battery fire at British guns. They held reserves ready to plug gaps, repel breakthroughs, and fire overlapping fields of fire. British artillery was also tasked to cross a broad front, stretching many thousand yards. This diluted its power. The same number of shells spread thinner could not deliver crippling blows to any single point. The result: broken confidence. Men expected German lines smashed. Instead, they marched through intact wire, across barren shell holes, into storms of fire. In some sectors, shelling did cut wire, silence guns, or rupture trenches. In others, it left German defenses standing strong. Troops reaching enemy lines found resistance fierce. Some divisions suffered 80% casualties in mere minutes. Machine guns mowed them down where shells had failed to shred wire or destroy gun nests. For many soldiers, the realization came too late. Plans had promised safety, reality delivered slaughter. Private Frank Linley remembered British wire as narrow compared to theirs. When they said our guns would tear up the wire, I thought, by God, I hope so, but no. He watched men trapped, helpless, under blistering fire. This failure shattered the myth that artillery could break war's deadlock. Though the cost of shells had been enormous, results were mixed at best, and catastrophic where it mattered most. At command headquarters, maps littered with crater circles and failed explosions lay under scrutinizing light. Haig confronted the stark truth. Men believed the prep would secure victory. Instead, it delivered horror. The miscalculation sprang from faulty ammo, overused shrapnel, understrength heavy howitzers, and overconfidence. Artillery commanders overestimated the power of their guns. They had too few heavy shells to smash concrete dugouts. They fired shrapnel at wire, and day by day, wire remained. Dugouts survived. German men lived. The moral victory collapsed. As July 1st dawned, whistles blew. Thousands climbed out, only to meet German machine guns aimed at untamed wire, trenches unshaken, men unbroken. That first hour crushed faith. That first day inflicted more than 57,000 British casualties, almost 20,000 killed. Men in trenches at night whispered, "Was it betrayal? Our guns failed us." Letters home mentioned shock and sorrow. The war looked different afterward, for soldiers and commanders alike. In quiet corners of the battlefield, men sifted through shell-cracked earth. Some wept for mates. Some cursed commands. Some prayed forgiveness. At dawn, officers counted dead and wounded. They placed crude crosses. They updated losses. They faced the horror of failure. In command rooms, planning continued, but tactics shifted. The creeping barrage became standard. Artillery used aircraft and forward observers. Communication improved. Flexible tactics emerged. But none of it saved that first wave. The bombardment had failed, but lessons hardened. The British Army became wiser, more adaptive. Leaders learned destruction was not enough. They needed suppression, silencing guns, not total demolition. Yet the cost was buried in young bodies. Men like Thomas, Samuel, George, hopeful, brave, found that steel storms could fail, that plans could lie, that courage might not save them. As the battle ground on, hearts bore the weight of lost trust. And over the shattered fields, one question echoed through trenches and command rooms alike. Could artillery ever break this deadlock? Or was something deeper, bloodier, the only path forward? At the edge of no man's land, in the lingering silence, the next assault waited. Chapter 8. Ghosts Beneath the Earth. A thunderous roar shook the ground. A mountain of earth rose, momentarily blinding men. Then the world fell silent, until a second, deeper explosion spoke from beneath. That was Hawthorne Ridge. Far below no man's land, another war was raging, a silent, unseen war of tunnels and mines. Men dug in darkness, breathing dust and fear. Their fingers carved into chalk and earth. Their shovels whispered secrets. They were sappers, tunnelers, mere shadows beneath the battlefield. They called this the Underground War. Each tunnel started with one man's pickaxe bite. Slowly, sound pulled more men down. Some were miners before the war, coal, tin, used to working underground. They joined the army and found themselves beneath French soil, digging toward the German lines. Their goal, to place giant explosive charges beneath enemy trenches. This was not a simple tunnel. They built galleries, winding passages sometimes 200 feet below. They carved support timbers from trunks of French trees. They laid tracks for mine wagons. They worked by candlelight, lantern glow, or even the faint hum of head torches. Their world smelled of earth, sweat, and stale air. Imagine listening to the war above, rapture of guns, thunder of shells, while you crouch in half-darkness, every sound magnified. A footstep on a distant timber might be enemy patrol. A drip of water might signal a tunnel leak. A collapse could bury you. Their fear was constant, but they pressed on. One of these men was William Bill Turner, a miner from Durham. He had spent his life sinking shafts for coal. Now he sank for death. He dug toward a point beneath Hawthorne Ridge. His hands were thick with calluses. His muscles ached. But he dreamed of victory. He dreamed of surprise. He thought of home, his wife's face, their baby daughter. They called the mine his hope. "I dig for us," he once said. They laughed. But laughter died when a tunnel roof cracked, sending him plunging into darkness. He hit bottom. Silence. Then, rescued. His mates pulled him out. He pressed his hand to his chest. "I won't stop," he whispered. Every night, Turner and others worked. They set charges. They crawled back to safe zones. They marked maps. They checked fuses. They calculated timings, down to the second. The explosion had to coincide with the infantry assault. This was engineering and gamble at its deadliest. When the mines exploded, they would blow massive craters in no man's land. The hope, the sudden gap would swallow German defenders. British troops would then take advantage, climb into the crater, shelter from fire, and launch an attack from a new low ground. But time was against them. Dig too slow, enemy engineers might discover and counterdig. Dig too quick, and the tunnel might collapse. Every man listened for enemy picks, for creaks, for silence that wasn't silence. They played cat and mouse, at depths of 30 to 40 feet below shell-scarred fields. Meanwhile, back above, officers drew tunnel networks on maps, lines in chalk connecting exits near Hawthorne Ridge and La Boisselle. They believed the mines were an ace buried in earth, unseen, unforgettable. Then came the day, July the 1st, 1916. Manhole covers blew skyward before the main assault. One huge mine detonated beneath Hawthorne Ridge. It formed a crater over 200 feet wide and 40 feet deep, a new scar in no man's land. The explosion's echo reached trenches half a mile away. Men staggered. The earth erupted. Smoke and dust filled the air. In that instant, the French sky darkened. Yet, many officers had delayed the infantry attack by 5 minutes to avoid friendly fire. That delay, small as a breath, would cost lives. Into that crater, men climbed, but they found no shattered Germans, no breakthrough. The dugouts beneath had absorbed the blast. The defenders emerged unshaken. They watched from newly solidified ground. And when the British soldiers appeared, they were ready. Turner stood at the crater's edge. He gasped at the scale. He saw bodies fall, his mates, lost in the hope of earth shock. He felt grief crush him. He realized the tunneling dream had summoned new ghosts. The mine had gone off, but the war beneath the earth had failed to claim victory. Other mines followed, dozens detonated across the front. Some created shelters in the chaos, some simply buried men alive. But none gave the decisive opening hoped. From the crater's lips, Turner wrote in his mind, "This is not the end." In the crater's shade, he saw William's face in every knock of a shovel. He heard laughter from home drowned in the rumble of collapsing earth. The tunnels remained. The war above continued. The infantry advance faltered. Men retreated back to trenches. Dogs barked in ruined trenches. Men pulled wounded into dark dugouts. They spoke little. The mines had made noise, but noise alone cannot break wire, silence guns, or stop bullets. That night, Turner returned to tunnels to check collapses. He lit candles alone. His colleagues whispered prayers. Some wept. Above ground, charge counters ticked. Craters rose and cooled. But no man could claim ownership. The land had swallowed them all. In field hospitals, stretcher-bearers moved wounded from craters. Many were cut by debris. Some were wounded by their own side. The explosion had not chosen friends. The crater at Hawthorne Ridge became both grave and observation point. Officers used its lip to watch German lines. But no earth-shattered victory came. By dawn, the smoke had lifted. Birds circled overhead. Sunlight rested on scorched chalk. Turner climbed out. He looked back at the darkness beneath. He felt its weight in his bones. He thought of his wife, of his daughter, of the tunnel still alive below. Tomorrow, he would go back down. The war beneath the earth would continue. Engineers would dig new galleries. Mines would be loaded. Charges timed. The underground war would go on. Because shadows fight for the unseen. Because silence can kill just as breath can. Because the land held secrets and men chased them. On the surface, infantry reassembled. They checked maps. They counted losses. They shared whispered blame. The mines, we thought they'd break them. But the Germans had not broken. They had adapted. They had survived. And underground, Turner carved deeper. The earth trembled again. He steadied his pickaxe. He whispered, this time we end it. And far below, in the tunnel's mouth, the final fuse waited. Above ground, guns roared again. Tomorrow, the earth would scream. Chapter 9, Letters from the Somme. A shell exploded nearby. The ground trembled. Men cried out, their voices swallowed by the roar of guns. In the chaos, a soldier sat down, hands trembling, and pulled from his pocket a small, worn notebook. He opened it, dipped his pen, and began to write. Words spilled onto the paper, not of strategy or battle plans, but of hope, fear, and the raw, unfiltered human heart. This is the story of the Battle of the Somme told through the voices of those who lived it. Letters and diaries from soldiers on both sides, reaching across time to bring us face to face with the people behind the statistics, the names behind the casualties. In July of 1916, the front line stretched for miles, a twisted scar of mud, wire, and shattered trees. Trenches dug into the earth like wounds, their occupants trapped between relentless artillery fire and the no-man's land that promised death with every step. Private Thomas Harper, a 19-year-old from a small village in England, wrote to his mother just days before the battle began. His words trembled with a mixture of courage and innocence. The nights are long and cold, Mother. The mud seeps into everything. Our boots, our clothes, even our souls. But we laugh to keep the fear at bay. I think of home, of your warm hands. Please pray for me. I carry you with me in every step. Thomas was young, too young to grasp fully the horrors awaiting him. His letter was a beacon of hope, a fragile thread connecting the hell of the trenches to the warmth of home. But hope in the Somme was a precious, fleeting thing. Across the lines, Wilhelm Fischer, a German corporal, penned his own words to his wife. His letter was filled with exhaustion and resolve. The guns never stop. The sky is black with smoke, and the air tastes of death. We stand in endless trenches, waiting. Your face is my shield in this madness. I dream of peace, but war drags us deeper into its darkness. Wilhelm's words echo the shared humanity between enemies, men caught in a conflict far greater than themselves, clinging to the hope of reunion with loved ones. Letters like these were lifelines. Carried in muddy pockets, scribbled on scraps of paper by candlelight, they were sometimes read aloud in dugouts, their fragile hope a balm against despair. Other times, they were hidden deep in the folds of uniforms, the last comfort before the whistle blew. Private Joseph Grant, who would survive the battle, wrote in his diary on July 1, 1916, the day the offensive began. At dawn, the whistles blew. We climbed out into a world torn apart. The wire was like twisted snakes blocking our way. Men fell beside me. The air was thick with smoke and cries. I saw friends fall, some never to rise again. I wonder if I will see another dawn. Joseph's words bring us close to the terror, the confusion, the overwhelming loss that defined that day. They remind us that behind the strategy and statistics were human beings, friends, sons, brothers, each with a story. Mary Ellis, a nurse serving near the front, collected letters from soldiers she cared for. She kept a journal, writing. Their words paint a world I cannot forget. The endless waiting, the sudden screams, the faces of boys turned men too soon. Each letter is a thread in the tapestry of grief and courage. The war's brutality was recorded not only in official reports, but in these intimate documents. The letters that never reached home, the diaries buried in the mud, the whispered prayers shared in moments between shelling. One poignant letter, never sent, was found decades later in the Somme fields. Written by James Wells, a young soldier who would never return, it read, "If this reaches you, know I fought with all my strength. The mud clings to my soul, but I hold on. Remember me not as a casualty, but as a man who dreamed of peace." These letters bridged the century, giving voice to the ghosts who still haunt the battlefields. They tell us that war is not just a clash of armies, but a clash of hopes, fears, and dreams. As night falls over the Somme, the silence holds these words, and the question lingers: how do we carry these voices forward, beyond the mud and blood, beyond the guns and the graves? The answer lies in remembrance, and in listening to the stories that still speak to us from beneath the earth. And in the stillness, one last thought echoes. What did it truly cost to write these letters? What would it take to write them again? The war was far from over. The battle continued. But in these words, the human spirit endured. Chapter 10. The Men Who Wouldn't Die. The earth exploded beneath their feet, shells crashing like thunder around them. Yet, deep beneath the ground, they remained untouched. Safe. Waiting. Alive. These were the men who wouldn't die. When the British artillery barrage began on July 1st, 1916, it was meant to obliterate German defenses, to smash trenches, tear apart barbed wire, and silence machine guns. But the German soldiers were not where the guns could reach them. They were deep underground, in bunkers carved into the earth, in labyrinthine dugouts that could withstand the fiercest shelling. Imagine being buried alive, yet fully awake. The air thick with dust and the acrid smell of explosives. The ground shaking violently above. The cacophony so intense it could split a man's mind. This was not a moment for the faint-hearted. But these men had prepared. They had learned to survive the impossible. German defensive tactics were built on survival and resilience. Their deep dugouts, some over 30 feet below the surface, were engineering marvels, a fortress beneath the battlefield. Thick walls of reinforced timber and concrete shielded them from the bombardment that tore apart the land above. Inside, men huddled in near silence, awaiting their moment. One such soldier, Friedrich Müller, described it simply. "We lay beneath the earth, the noise like the end of the world. Our ears rang, our hearts pounded, but we lived." For hours, sometimes days, they stayed underground, protected from the rain of shells. When the barrage lifted, they climbed out with weapons ready. They emerged into a shattered landscape, where the British infantry expected empty trenches, ruined wire, and broken men. Instead, they met with relentless machine gun fire. The German soldiers had survived the storm and were prepared to turn the tide. Their machine guns, especially the deadly MG-08, were positioned in well-protected nests, covering every inch of no man's land with sweeping fire. As British soldiers advanced across the open fields, these guns cut them down in waves. Lieutenant Hans Becker, a machine gunner, recalled, "When the whistles blew and the enemy came, we opened fire. The field was full of men falling. It was like a nightmare." German tactics emphasized patience and discipline. Instead of firing blindly, they waited for the perfect moment, maximizing their firepower. Their deep dugouts gave them the endurance to withstand the worst of the bombardment and the strength to strike when it mattered most. This methodical defense devastated British forces. Some units lost up to 80% of their men within minutes. The British had miscalculated. They believed the artillery would clear the way. They believed the Germans would be broken. But the men underground proved otherwise. They refused to die. For many British soldiers, the reality was a cruel awakening. They faced a deadly trap hidden beneath the earth's surface. Corporal James Harding wrote in his diary, "We thought the guns had killed them all, but they were waiting like ghosts, and the machine guns tore through us." The battle's early hours were marked by this horrific mismatch, men advancing into a hailstorm of fire, while the enemy, sheltered and ready, survived the storm. The Germans had built not just trenches, but a fortress of survival. As the Somme raged on, The resilience of these men challenged the Allied hopes for a quick victory. But the question remained, how long could men endure such horrors, hidden in the darkness below, and still fight when the time came? In the shadows beneath the shattered fields, the men who wouldn't die prepared for the next wave. The war above was brutal, but the war beneath the earth was a battle of wills, of endurance, strategy, and sheer survival. And as the guns thundered once more, the men who wouldn't die stood ready, waiting to meet the next assault with steel, courage, and an unbreakable spirit. The Somme was far from over, and these men, buried but unbroken, were a deadly reminder. In this war, death was never certain. Survival was a battle all its own. Chapter 11. The Deadliest Ground, Thiepval and Beaumont-Hamel. It happened in minutes. In the span of a morning stroll, entire families vanished. Brothers, cousins, friends, all gone. The ground drank their blood faster than the sky could clear the smoke. It was July 1st, 1916, the opening day of the Battle of the Somme, a day already known for its brutality. But here, on the slopes of Thiepval Ridge and the chalky ground of Beaumont-Hamel, it was different. It was worse. Because here, it wasn't just a battle. It was a massacre. They had trained for months, dug trenches with frostbitten fingers, shared jokes in muddy dugouts, sang songs over cold tins of meat. Most were barely 20. Some lied about their age just to enlist, because they believed in something. They believed they'd be home by Christmas. But at Thiepval and Beaumont-Hamel, they would never come home. The orders were simple. Take the ridge. Push the line. Break the German front. But what they didn't know, what High Command refused to believe, was that this land had become a fortress. Beneath the gentle hills and flowering hedgerows were tunnels, bunkers, and fortified positions that no amount of artillery could fully destroy. For 7 days before the assault, British guns had shelled the enemy. Over 1.5 million shells rained down, more than anyone had ever seen. It was supposed to soften the ground, clear the barbed wire, and silence the German guns. But the Germans had dug deep into thick chalk soil and waited. And when the shelling finally stopped, they knew what was coming. At Thiepval, the 36th Ulster Division readied themselves. Men from Belfast, from Armagh, from the farms and shipyards of Northern Ireland. These weren't strangers thrown together. They were friends, neighbors, even schoolmates. Some came from the same churches. Others played on the same football teams. Now, they stood shoulder to shoulder, waiting for the signal to climb over the top. Many wrote letters that night, some to their sweethearts, others to their mothers. One simply said, "If I fall, tell them I did my bit." That's all I ever wanted. At 7:30 in the morning, the whistle blew. They rose, slowly, some with shaking hands, others with steel in their eyes. They didn't run. That's the part most don't understand. They walked, in formation, rifles held across their chests, like it was a parade. But this was no parade. It was a shooting gallery. The German machine guns opened up within seconds. They didn't have to aim. The lines were straight. The ground was open. The Ulstermen fell like wheat beneath a scythe. Still, they pushed on, through the torn wire, through craters still steaming, through the screams of the wounded behind them. Incredibly, some made it. They reached the German first line, cleared it, fought with bayonets and rifle butts and grenades. It was chaos. It was hell. But they held on. And then silence. No reinforcements came. Communication was broken. The fog of war, real and metaphorical, swallowed the plan whole. The Ulster Division was alone, surrounded, and out of time. By nightfall, over 5,000 of them were dead or wounded. An entire generation from a small island had been broken in a single day. But it wasn't the only place that bled. Just a few miles north, another tragedy was unfolding. Beaumont-Hamel. Here, the Royal Newfoundland Regiment, some 800 men, waited in support trenches. They weren't even supposed to go forward that early. But when the British advance stalled, someone gave the order. Go. Their objective was clear. Take the German lines. Cross no man's land. Link up with the rest of the force. But there was one problem. The wire hadn't been cut. Barbed wire, in theory, was supposed to be blown apart by artillery. In practice, it was a death net. A wall of twisted metal, waist-high in places, that snagged clothing, rifles, flesh. And worse, the Germans could see everything. The Newfoundlanders had to advance from a communication trench called St. John's Road, straight into open ground. No smoke cover, no support, just sky above and rifles in front. At 9:15 a.m., they went over the top. Within 15 minutes, nearly every officer was dead. The rest didn't fare better. Men tried to sprint. Others crawled. Some got tangled in the wire and were cut down where they lay. A few reached the halfway point. There was a tree, a bent and twisted landmark known forever after as the Danger Tree. That was as far as most of them would ever go. Out of nearly 800 men, only 68 answered roll call the next morning. Entire communities in Newfoundland woke up to telegrams and silence. One mother lost 4 sons in a single hour. Another family lost a father, a son, and a cousin, all on the same stretch of broken ground. There are stories, small, human stories, that history books rarely mention. Like the soldier who tucked his fiancée's photograph into his tunic and whispered, "Soon," before stepping over the sandbag. Or the captain who walked ahead of his men, smoking a cigarette, because he didn't want them to see his hands shake. Or the teenage bugler who kept playing the advance, even after the line had been shattered, until a bullet found his chest. These were not myths, not symbols. They were people, living, breathing, terrified people. The irony is cruel. The planners believed the Germans had been destroyed, that their defenses were shattered. But at Thiepval and Beaumont Hamel, the German machine guns were untouched. Their trenches were intact, their resolve unbroken, and the cost of that miscalculation was measured in lifetimes. Even the ground changed. The chalk soil, so light and dry, turned to paste in the blood and rain. Shell holes filled with limbs and water. Helmets floated like dead leaves. When the fighting finally moved on, when other divisions came through, they found the bodies piled in heaps. Some with faces serene, as if sleeping. Others frozen mid-crawl. A few still holding hands. The land was never the same. Today, at Thiepval, a massive memorial towers over the ridge. Inscribed on it are over 72,000 names. British and South African soldiers who died in the Somme and have no known grave. At Beaumont Hamel, the battlefield has been preserved. You can still see the trenches, the wire, the Danger Tree. It's one of the few places where the land hasn't been rebuilt or paved over. Because here, the past never really left. Newfoundland, still a separate dominion at the time, marks July 1st not just as Canada Day, but as Memorial Day. Because for them, the Somme wasn't just a battle, it was a national wound. And for those who survived, life was never the same. Many never spoke of what they saw. Some couldn't sleep. Others drank to forget. A few wrote poems, letters, memoirs, trying to make sense of it all. One man, who had crawled back wounded from Thiepval, later said, "We thought we were lions. But that field it made lambs of us all." The Battle of the Somme would rage on for months. New offensives, new tactics, new horrors. But what happened at Thiepval and Beaumont Hamel on that first day, what those men endured, became a symbol of courage, of failure, of sacrifice without reason. And yet, there was more to come. Because just south of the Somme, another plan was forming. A strategy meant to change the shape of the war. A breakthrough, or so they believed. But the earth had other ideas. And soon, the skies over the Somme would darken again. Not with shells, but with fire. Chapter 12. Brothers in Arms, the PALS battalions. They came from the same streets. They played in the same parks, went to the same schools, worked the same jobs. On the morning of July 1st, 1916, they climbed out of their trenches together. And by nightfall, most of them were gone. The sun rose slowly over the trenches near Serra, a small French village that had become a deadly fortress. The air was still, eerily quiet after a week of constant shelling. And then came the sound. 3 whistles, sharp and quick. That was the signal. They stood, rows and rows of them. Young men, barely old enough to shave, now moving forward across no man's land with rifles held tight and eyes locked ahead. They didn't run. They were told to walk. At the front of one line marched the men of the Accrington PALS. A battalion made up of friends from the small Lancashire town of Accrington. They had signed up together, trained together, and now they would die together. It took only 15 minutes. Just 15. But in that time, over 700 of them were either killed or wounded. Some never even made it past the barbed wire. There was Private William Turner, who had worked at the local mill. He had promised his mother he would come home by Christmas. His last letter home read, "Don't worry, Mom. We're all together here, and we're looking out for each other." He never came home. Neither did his brother, or his cousin, or his best friend from school. But it wasn't just Accrington. This was a national tragedy that rippled through towns and villages across Britain. They were called the PALS battalions, an idea born from patriotism and community pride. In the early days of the war, Lord Kitchener launched a massive recruitment drive. His face stared out from posters across the country, finger pointed, words bold. "Your country needs you." And the people responded. Not just individuals, but groups. Friends, co-workers, teammates. The idea was simple. Join the army with your friends. Fight together. Serve together. Come home together. Entire football teams signed up. Post office workers. Bank clerks. Coal miners. In Leeds, the city's best and brightest joined what became known as the Leeds Pals. In Sheffield, the Wednesday Football Club enlisted en masse. In Glasgow, the boys from the shipyards marched into recruitment offices side by side. And in those early days, there was joy, pride, a sense of adventure. They called it a grand holiday. For many, it was their first time leaving their hometown, their first time wearing a uniform, their first time riding a train. But that excitement would soon fade. By July 1st, 1916, these pals had been in training for over a year. When the order came to go over the top, they believed in their mission. They believed in victory. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that the artillery had failed. The week-long bombardment, designed to destroy German defenses, had barely scratched the surface. Barbed wire still stretched thick across no man's land. Machine gun nests, buried deep in concrete bunkers, had survived untouched. German troops had waited out the shelling deep underground. And now, as the PALS battalions advanced in perfect, tragic formation, the guns opened fire. It was like mowing grass. At Sarah, at Fricourt, at La Boisselle, the story was the same. Whole companies wiped out in minutes. Captain Billy Leach of the Barnsley PALS later recalled, "The men were just blown to bits. It was a slaughterhouse." One officer, watching from behind the lines, broke down in tears. He had grown up with these men. He knew their families. He had watched them play cricket in the summers. Now he watched them fall, one by one. In the town of Accrington, word spread quickly. First through whispers, then telegrams, then silence. Shops closed. Curtains were drawn. The entire town seemed to stop. One resident said, "You couldn't go down the street without passing a house in mourning." It was grief on a scale no one had imagined. In Sheffield, the football club that had proudly marched to war returned with barely a team. In Grimsby, an entire fishing crew was lost. In Manchester, the clerks who had worked in the same office died in the same trench. And what made it worse, what made it unbearable, was that there was no escape from it. Because they had all joined together, they had all died together. It was like a single thread pulled from the fabric of a town, unraveling everything. The military had not anticipated this. They had not considered what would happen if entire units were drawn from the same communities. It was efficient for recruiting. It was catastrophic in combat. After the Somme, the PALS model was quietly abandoned. The cost had been too high. But what those young men left behind was more than grief. They left behind a legacy of courage, of loyalty, of sacrifice. They proved something unshakable, that in the face of terror, men would still stand for each other. They would still move forward, not because they believed they would survive, but because the man next to them had trusted them. They died not just for country, but for friendship, for memory, for home. And if you walk today through the quiet cemeteries at Sarah or Thiepval, if you pause to read the headstones, you'll notice something. Names that repeat. Brothers buried side by side. Friends resting just feet apart. A row of Wilkinsons from Sheffield. 3 McAllisters from Glasgow. 24 Jacksons from Barnsley, all under 22. Their gravestones don't say much. Just a name, a rank, a date. But behind every one of them is a family that never healed, a mother that never stopped waiting, a town that never forgot. Back in Accrington, there's a small memorial in the town square. It simply reads, "They did not come back, but they never walked alone." And this is the heartbreaking truth of the PALS battalions. It was unity that made them strong, and unity that made the loss so complete. The Battle of the Somme would rage on for months. But on that first day, July 1st, over 19,000 British soldiers were killed. Of those, thousands were from the PALS battalions. They had believed they would come home together. Instead, they became a symbol, a warning, and a memory carved into the soul of Britain. But this story doesn't end in silence. Because in the chaos of that day, in the mud, the blood, the fear, there was also a flicker of something else. Something still alive, still human, even in the machine age of war. What happened when a wounded soldier, left for dead in no man's land, heard the voice of a friend calling for help? He crawled, through the barbed wire, through fire, through death. Why? Because that's what they had promised each other. They had said, "We go together, no matter what." But did he make it? Did either of them? That story is still to come. Chapter 13, Command and Controversy. The battlefield was littered with corpses. Command posts were buzzing with frantic telegrams. Yet up there, miles from the mud and wire, a man sat quietly, peering at maps and statistics, his face unreadable. This was Douglas Haig, the man at the center of both reverence and rage, loved by some as a visionary leader, loathed by others as a butcher. And now, his legacy lay on trial. General Sir Douglas Haig, tall, precise, reserved, believed he understood modern war better than most. He had watched the static slaughter at Ypres, learned from its horrors, and arrived at the Somme with a plan: massive artillery, methodical infantry, breaking through German defenses like a wedge. To him, war was a matter of calculation, of steel and strategy. He trusted discipline, training, and steel storms to do what emotion could not. But what he did not know, what no general could truly know, was what lived beneath the ground. The deep dugouts that shielded enemy defenders. The 1,000-yard webs of barbed wire that refused to bow. The human spirit that could endure even the heaviest bombardment. On the morning of July 1st, Haig sat in a dugout behind the lines. The roar of artillery was deafening. Beneath him, he believed, the wire lay broken. The paths clear. The enemy broken. He was confident, his voice calm as he issued orders. Advance. Hold the crest. Break through. But confidence is fragile, and so is human life. By midday, reports began. Trenches intact, sir. Our men pinned. Casualties mounting. Still, the plan pressed on, wave after wave. And on that day, over 57,000 British soldiers fell, nearly 20,000 dead. When news reached Haig, he did not break. He absorbed it, adjusted plans, and pressed forward. To some, this was courage. To others, it was coldness. To them, he was a butcher, sending men to die in killing zones. Yet the story is not that simple. Haig had led earlier victories, at Cambrai, during the war's final year, where new tactics and tanks broke through deep. He had seen the evolution of warfare and had embraced change. Artillery, creeping barges, meticulous planning. He believed in a measured approach. He believed that patience and technology would overcome the trenches. Still, controversy clung to him. After the Somme, soldiers bitterly criticized the slaughter. Families mourned in towns across Britain. Politicians and critics called for Haig's head. Some historians argued he was a Victorian relic, an ivory tower commander who saw men as pawns. They pointed to the PALS battalions, decimated units drawn from single towns, and asked, did he understand the cost? Others defended him. They pointed to the improvements his command brought: better medical care, more flexible tactics, better communication systems. They argued that wars are cruel, that Germany had to be worn down, that without the Somme, there would be no victory in 1918. Haig's defenders highlight his post-war reflections. He said, We had to fight the battle somewhere. He described the Somme as a necessary soil in which the seeds of victory were planted. His critics described him differently. The butcher of the Somme. They saw strategy divorced from humanity. They saw maps, not men. Even today, more than a century on, historians argue. Some look back and see inevitability. The war demanded sacrifice. Haig delivered it. Others see tragedy. He chose command over caution, saw broken men shirked as resources, not as sons. How do we judge Haig? By the numbers, he was brutal. By the outcome, he helped win. By the memories, he left deep scars. What he commanded was war in the modern age, a war won by replacing memories with statistics, courage with calculation, blood with maps. He stood at the crossroads of change, but the road he chose left rivers of loss behind. At Ypres, he learned. At the Somme, he tested. In 1918, he adapted. He trusted new weapons, better tactics. He drew lessons. He believed he had done what were forced him to do. But lessons do not erase death. Maps do not comfort mothers. Strategy cannot revive a lost friend. And so Haig remains a figure of myth and controversy, a man who saw war as a science, and who waged it by the principle of sacrifice. As the war ground on, as tanks rolled and trenches shifted, as new tactics emerged and new leaders rose, Haig stayed. He pressed on. He planned. And he watched men die by the thousands. In his notebooks, he once wrote, "The art of war, like any other art, demands great courage and patience. But courage and patience, when measured in human lives, leave marks on both the living and the dead." The Somme would claim hundreds of thousands more victims. The debate over Haig's command would continue for decades. Some names would fade. Haig's name endured. Yet as night fell over the French countryside, silence pressing on cratered lines, one question echoed in empty bunkers and silent graves. Did his vision win the war, or cost too much? And across shattered fields, the answer waited. Chapter 14, The Machinery of Death. It started with a sound, unmistakable, unrelenting, a grinding mechanical roar, like thunder stitched to a scream. As British troops rose from their trenches at 0 hour, it hit them, waves of bullets, faster than anything they'd ever imagined. The MG-08, the German Maskenengewehr, spat fire at the rate of 400 rounds per minute. Each bullet sang death across no man's land. One moment, a man was running beside his friend. The next, he was gone, his body twisted, torn apart, and silent. This wasn't just war. This was industrialized slaughter. In the early hours of July 1st, 1916, over 100,000 British soldiers surged forward. They were met by fewer than 40,000 Germans, deeply dug into bunkers and supported by some of the most terrifying weapons the world had ever seen. Machine guns, mortars, artillery, tools not just of defense, but of annihilation. Let's pause for a moment. Imagine you're 20 years old. You've been training for months. They told you the bombardment would wipe out the Germans, flatten their trenches, destroy their barbed wire, send them retreating in chaos. They told you that when you went over the top, it would be a walk to victory. But the moment your boots leave the trench, you realize everything is wrong. You hear it before you see it. The buzz of a machine gun, low and fast, like a sewing machine gone mad. A line of dirt spits up to your left. Then another, closer. Then blood. A man next to you collapses without a sound, the top of his head simply gone. You drop instinctively, but there's nowhere to hide. No cover. No escape. This was the machinery of death. The MG-08 was based on Hiram Maxim's original design. Water-cooled, belt-fed, operated by a team of 3 to 6 men. It was heavy, awkward, and devastatingly effective. Positioned behind sandbags or inside concrete pillboxes, it could cut down hundreds in minutes. And it did. Again and again. British soldiers, by contrast, carried the Lee Enfield rifle. It was reliable, bolt-action, and had a 10-round magazine. A skilled rifleman could fire around 15 shots per minute. It was a marvel in its own right, accurate and fast compared to earlier weapons. But it could not compete with the MG-08. Not in sheer volume. not in shock. Still, the rifle became the soldier's lifeline, a tool they learned to master, to care for like a limb. Some even gave them names. Old Faithful, Bessie. In the chaos of war, a working rifle was hope in metal form. But machine guns weren't the only terror. Mortars, small, portable cannons, were used to lob shells into enemy trenches. The Germans had the Minenwerfer, meaning mine thrower, short-barreled and deadly. The British had their Stokes mortar, a simpler, quicker design that would evolve into modern mortar systems. These weapons didn't fire straight like rifles. Instead, they arced high, dropping their shells like deadly rain. They were used to soften up enemy lines, but often, they just created chaos, churning the mud, dismembering men, and adding to the nightmare of trench warfare. And then came something out of hell itself, flamethrowers. The Germans used them first, and when they appeared, soldiers froze in disbelief. A hiss, a roar, and then a torrent of fire arcing through the air, sticking to everything it touched. It wasn't just a weapon, it was psychological destruction. Imagine a wall of flame racing toward your trench, igniting uniforms, faces, hope. There was no defense, no honor, just panic and pain. To call it inhumane misses the point. War had become something new at the Somme, something colder, more mechanical. The value of a man was measured in inches gained on a map. The decisions were made far behind the lines, by generals and staff, sitting in chateaus with maps and telegraphs, insulated from the mud and blood. And those decisions demanded tools. Tools that could kill, quickly, efficiently, without pause. The creeping barrage was another one. An artillery tactic where shells landed just ahead of advancing infantry. It was meant to shield them, to pin down the enemy while the men moved forward. But timing was everything. Too slow, and the enemy had time to recover. Too fast, and your own men walked into friendly fire. Many did. Some were vaporized by shells from their own guns. Even communication was a risk. Soldiers relied on runners, pigeons, and field telephones to relay orders. But wires were cut. Birds were shot. Runners were gunned down. Confusion was the norm. In the noise, smoke, and fury, men often had no idea where the front line ended or began. Technology had outpaced tactics. Commanders still dreamed of cavalry charges and bayonet assaults. But the battlefield had changed. It was now dominated by steel, fire, and noise. Human flesh could not keep up. The British lost nearly 60,000 men on the first day alone. That's nearly one man every second. And the guns never stopped. Day after day, week after week. The weapons didn't just kill. They reshaped the land. Shell holes turned green fields into lunar landscapes. Trees were splintered into blackened stumps. Rivers clogged with corpses overflowed with rot. The Somme Valley, once peaceful, became a graveyard of iron and bone. Yet amid all this horror, there was courage. Men crawled through wire under fire. Medics dragged the wounded through mud while shells burst around them. Riflemen held lines for hours with just a few rounds left. Engineers built bridges under fire. Every day, ordinary soldiers did the impossible, not for glory, not for orders, but for the men beside them. They lived and died in the shadow of machines they couldn't understand. Devices forged in factories far from the front, designed by men who'd never seen a trench. And yet, these machines ruled their world. Back home, newspapers spoke of progress, of new inventions, of triumph through science. But the men in the mud knew better. They saw what the machines could do, not just to bodies, but to minds, to hope. Shell shock was rising, what we now know as PTSD. Men came home with haunted eyes, twitching, silent, afraid of sudden sounds. Some never spoke again. The machinery of death didn't just take lives, it broke them. By late November, after 141 days, the Battle of the Somme ended. The front line had moved barely 6 miles. Over 1 million men were killed or wounded. The MG-08, the Leonfield, the mortar, the flamethrower, they had all done their job. But what had they built? The Somme became a symbol, not of victory, but of senselessness. A place where men and machines collided, and humanity lost something it could never get back. And still, the war continued. Because somewhere, beyond the shattered trees and muddy craters, new weapons were being tested. New ideas, more deadly still, were being drawn up. One of them, silent, invisible, and green, would soon rise over the trenches like a ghost. Gas. And it would change everything. Chapter 15, Mud, Blood, and Barbed Wire. The earth swallowed them whole, soldiers trapped in deep craters, mud reaching their chests, barbed wire cutting them down without warning. This was the Somme. They called it no man's land, but that name didn't begin to capture the horror. It was a quagmire of mud and blood, trenches carved into the earth by shells, and the tangled thickets of wire that turned advance into agony. Picture this. A landscape littered with craters so large they swallowed carts and men, filling with water and dread. These craters were born not of nature, but of steel, massive shells that burst through the ground with thunder, sending plumes of earth into the sky. When the rain came, the craters became pools, slick and black, hiding jagged debris, bodies, rifles, helmets, and shattered bones beneath and around the waterline. Shell-shocked, foot-sodden men approached these pits, soaked up to their kneecaps. Their uniforms clung to flesh. Every movement was a battle, mud tugging at boots, swallowing them inch by inch. It was as if the battlefield was alive, reaching up to claim them. Barbed wire grew like twisted vines across no man's land. Not a single strand, but layers, 3, 4, sometimes 5 lines thick, twisted together to form barriers that looked easy until you got close. Wire sharp enough to slice flesh, tangled enough to halt an entire platoon. Soldiers carried wire cutters, but blades slipped on wet metal. Gloves didn't help. They were wet or torn. Many didn't reach the German trenches because they simply couldn't cut through. These wire jungles served a cruel purpose. They bought time. They broke momentum. They turned runs into stumbles. Bears, oxen, they'd resist for brief moments. Men died trying. Then there were trenches, the arteries of the battlefield. Frontline trenches, support trenches, reserve trenches, each one carved in zigzag patterns to limit blast. Walls reinforced by sandbags, timber, wicker gabions, steel plates. Roofed in some places to protect against shrapnel in what were called dugouts. The deeper trenches, built like small rooms, offered fleeting shelter. But every time a shell made direct hit, wood splintered, mud collapsed, earth fell. Some men died buried standing. Trench bottoms became layers of disease. Drainage was poor. Water pooled. Rats thrived. Soldiers called them trench rats. They grew fat on leftovers and corpses. A man might lose sleep to scurrying near his head. Lice were a constant torment. Fleas, too. Scratching was a torment, but better than doing nothing. Hygiene, an impossible dream. Rats fed on mud-soaked bread and bully beef. But the real horror was disease. Trench foot, when wet boots and socks were never changed, could turn flesh black, kill the tissue. Amputation was often the only cure. Doctors tried whale oil or paraffin, but mud won. Dysentery tore through lines when latrines overflowed. Bodies were burned or dumped. The smell rose with the humidity. Typhoid, cholera, silent killers that stalked trenches as men slept. Few things defined the Somme's landscape better than its smell. Mud, blood, cordite, decay. Together they formed a swamp of stench that clung to lungs. You carried it in your boots, your breath, your clothes and soul. To step into no man's land was to enter a realm made of nightmares and physics failed by men who underestimated nature and terrain. The earth itself became the greatest enemy. A soldier moving at speed across broken fields could reach a crater and sink to his waist in muck. A plunged foot might find no ground. A leg could go through to the knee before clothes blocked movement. Once stuck, men had to wait for help or die. Some walked in circles for hours, lost in mud and shell shock, disoriented by craters that all looked the same. Crater fields often created broken terrain that commanders used for cover, but only after the battle. During the battle, they were death traps. You might hide behind a lip for a while, but German observers would aim at the edge. A lucky shell would stamp out any slight shelter. Those who survived inside a crater crouched, watched, and waited for smoke to clear. Then they noticed the bodies around them, some fresh, some raked by rain. Silence became oppressive. Even the rats seemed paused, hiding from the carnage above. Between trenches and craters, men faced another peril: narrow duckboards. Built over wet, muddy trenches to help drainage, these wooden walkways were slick and weak. When hit by shell fragments, they broke into planks. Men fell into cesspits. Wounds became infected. Feet froze. Newspapers later wrote of soldiers lost under duckboards. Families spared the truth. Rest periods were no relief. Support trenches, tinned up and sulfurous, housed thousands. Men were relieved hours only to return to the same filth. Tins from bully beef stacked on parapets, mold spun on stale biscuits. Rats gnawed at blankets. Flooding forced some to build inner platforms of mud and wire, small islands where they could lie. But mud rose with rain, burying trenches and men alike. Some soldiers died buried upright in dugouts. One private wrote home, "This land is cursed. The mud drags you down. The wire kills you. We fight earth itself before we reach them." Many diaries tell simple truths. No man should live like this. Shelling destroyed not only trenches, but souls. The sound of a shell was so constant, you couldn't hear your own heartbeat. Some men instinctively ducked at thunder. Others wore ear protection, hardened corks, but they stuffed their ears so tight they heard nothing but ringing. When guns fell silent, a wrecked trench would howl with wind passing through shattered timber. Men lay awake, afraid of quiet more than noise. Soldiers learned to refer to fields by code names: Regina Trench, Mash Valley, Dead Man's Corner, Sunken Lane. Each name carried a story. Some smelled of fight, some of graves. They were landmarks in a landscape that no longer made sense. Families mailed sweets, socks, cigarettes to keep men sane. But their parcels arrived damp, rotted. Men shredded the packaging to stuff their boots. Some traded cigarettes for brownies baked in villages outside the line. It was black market life, tiny reprieves in hell. Yet every so often, a strange beauty emerged. At dawn, mist washed over craters like pale ghosts. Sunlight crept up trench walls, lighting moss and tiny flowers grown in bone dust. Birds, skylarks, sometimes sang above the silence. On drier ground, bright red poppies sprang from the blood-soaked mud. They were small defiance, but they could not hide the dead. Men learned to focus on small things: a hot cup of tea, a clean sock, a letter folded 3 times, tucked in an inside pocket, dog-eared and hope-wrapped. The ground gave nothing. They made comfort from scraps. Camaraderie kept them human. One corporal said, "This mud is hell, but I've seen more bravery here than anywhere. I've seen lads cover mates. Men laugh when they shouldn't. I've seen the poppies. They remind us we're still alive." This terrain, contrary, cruel, impossible, shaped the battle in every moment. It destroyed plans, killed optimism, turned dreams to drudgery. It made commanders think twice. It broke armies as much as bullets did. If you ever walk the Somme today, the land seems peaceful and green. But you'll find deep craters, mossy trunks, wire left in hedges. You'll feel the ground quiver under footsteps. You'll notice silence and wonder, could all that noise, that blood, that mud, have changed the world? As dawn breaks on another day, another assault planned, the men prepare again. Their boots need lacing tight. Their rifles need slinging right. Their hearts uncertain. For the Somme isn't just a name. It's a place shaped by mud, blood, and barbed wire, where every inch was paid for in flesh. And tomorrow, they must cross it again. Chapter 16, The French Advance. A tremor in the earth, a cry in the distance. Suddenly, a new hope emerged where death had reigned. In the midst of chaos and carnage along the Somme, while British lines stagnated in mud and blood, the French army began to push forward, determined to reclaim ground and restore the balance. The advance was unexpected, a flash of courage in a theater of despair. Under a slate-gray sky pierced by the shrill cries of artillery and the anguished shouts of command, French soldiers emerged from their battered trenches in the southern sector. Their faces, etched with exhaustion and resolve, glistened in the early light. They moved deliberately, with a purpose born of long months of attrition and sacrifice. Every step was heavy with doubt, yet each heartbeat spoke of the longing for redemption and victory. In that fleeting moment, as shells still roared in the distance, they advanced. Colonel Laurent Dubois, a seasoned officer with silver at his temples and eyes that had seen too much, led his men with a quiet determination. He carried with him not only his well-worn map and faded orders, but also the hope of a people that had endured unthinkable suffering. Laurent remembered his own youth, a time when the fields of his native province overflowed with sunshine and laughter. Now, he witnessed the same sky weep for fallen comrades, yet he refused to yield. With each cautious step forward, he whispered to his men, "For France, for our future," as if invoking a sacred promise. The landscape they faced was nothing short of a nightmare made real. No man's land was a morass of churned-up earth, scarred by massive craters that gaped like hungry maws. The mud was thick and unyielding, clinging to boots and uniforms alike. Barbed wire, twisted into grotesque shapes by relentless shellfire, lay like serpents across the field. And yet, amidst this hellish terrain, the French advance would begin. They moved as one, minds sharpened by loss, hearts buoyed by a stubborn hope that defied the omnipresent darkness. In a narrow, temporary corridor between German fortifications and the shattered remnants of British positions, Private Antoine Martin pressed forward. Antoine was barely out of his teens, a farmer's son who had grown up tending vineyards under the gentle sun, now forced into a world where even the light of day bore witness to unimaginable horror. His eyes were wide with both fear and fierce determination as he recalled the last words his father had spoken to him. "Stand tall, my son, and never let them see you falter." Every step through the mud was a battle. Every breath was a defiant act against the despair that so often engulfed his comrades. The French artillery had been more precise, more carefully coordinated than its British counterpart. For weeks, French commanders had dug deep into their reserves of cannon and howitzer, reworking tactics to conserve shells and maximize the shock effect on German defenses. They had learned from earlier mistakes, lessons carved in the tears of fallen soldiers and the bitter ink of critical reports. As the artillery batteries pounded designated targets with a concentrated fury, the roar of explosions formed a backdrop to the disciplined stride of French infantry. But even as the bombardment cleared several key sectors, doubts crept in. The earth, mud and blood mixed with ash, became a quagmire where determination could easily yield to despair. At one critical juncture, a section of the advancing unit found itself halted by a seemingly insurmountable barrier, a stretch of uncut barbed wire that snaked across a shallow, newly formed crater. The men paused, rifles in hand, hearts pounding in unison like the drumbeats of a funeral march. Their sergeant, a grizzled veteran known as Le Fer, barked in order. Cut through now. With wire cutters clutched tightly, the group worked frantically. The sound of metal slicing through twisted strands was drowned out by explosions overhead, and every second stretched interminably, as if time itself mourned the delay. In that moment of uncertainty, the fate of the advance hung in the balance. Meanwhile, behind enemy lines, German soldiers who had long believed the battle's fury was reserved for the British front now watched with wary eyes as the French repositioned. Rumors of the French resurgence had traveled through broken channels. Whispers passed between trenches and along shattered telephone lines. To the Germans, who had endured the full weight of the British bombardment, the sight of disciplined French troops advancing was both a shock and a grim portent. They scrambled to reinforce their positions, hurriedly sending machine gun teams and reconfiguring defensive layouts. Among them was Lieutenant Hans Müller, a man whose steely gaze belied his own exhaustion. He muttered to himself, "They are back, and they come with the fire of our own making." The French had, in their unyielding spirit, ignited a new chapter of uncertainty on the battlefield. Back with the French, as Antoine Martin labored to cut through the oppressive wire, a sudden explosion rocked the ground. It was as if the earth itself rejected the advance, a reminder that every step forward could be your last. The blast sent shrapnel flying and splintered a nearby tree into a shower of wood and blood. Antoine's heart thundered. He looked around at his comrades, their eyes wide with shock and a surge of adrenaline igniting the dim light of morning. The encounter was brief but fierce. The loss of a nearby team member, a young man named Julian, was a stark reminder that hope came at the highest price. Antoine's hand trembled on his cutter, and he wondered, would this breakthrough be a triumph or just another sacrifice paid in full? The French artillery continued its measured barrage, a symphony of orchestrated destruction that pushed back the German lines. In carefully chosen pockets along the ridge, enemy trenches crumbled and fresh passages opened. Men moved into these gaps with an urgency that bordered on desperation. In the newly seized terrain, Colonel Dubois quickly reorganized his battered battalion. He signaled for medics and ordered a quick regrouping, his voice steady despite the chaos. "Hold this ground. Protect our flank," he ordered, his words slicing through the tension like a guiding light. His orders were simple, but they carried the weight of countless lives spent and sacrificed. In the distance, as the French advanced deeper into enemy territory, the landscape transformed. The endless mud, the ceaseless churn of barbed wire, gave way to a patchwork of obliterated trenches and twisted wreckage. Here, in these brief moments of reclaimed ground, there was a fleeting sense of possibility. The French soldiers could almost see the enemy's command posts, the heart of their organized resistance, starting to crumble under the relentless pressure. Yet, amid the sparks of triumph, the ever-present threat of counterattack loomed like a dark cloud on the horizon. Back in his forward command post, Colonel Dubois pored over maps that had been redrawn by the constant shifting of the front. He traced the outlines of new craters and marked the positions where enemy machine gun nests still held sway. Every line on the map represented 100 men, 100 dreams lost or burning bright with determination. The delicate balance of victory and futility was written in these chaotic, fractured sketches. His mind raced with questions that haunted him like ghosts. Had they advanced too far? Was the German line about to reorganize and counter? And most haunting of all, would the gains in this southern sector prove to be the turning point so desperately sought by a weary nation? On the ground, Antoine Martin and his companions pressed their advantage. Yet the toll was visible in every step they took. Faces were streaked with sweat and tears mixed with mud. Uniforms caked with grime. The grim reality was that every inch of new ground was purchased dearly. Men paused to help fallen comrades. Others whispered words of comfort in the language of homes long left behind. Every time a section successfully cleared a trench or hacked through a barrier of wire, an unspoken prayer was raised, not for glory, but for survival. Somewhere in the chaos, a young soldier, barely old enough to remember the softness of his mother's arms, clutched a letter in his blood-smeared hands. The letter, its edges torn by the onslaught, read simply, "I love you, Maman. Come find me in the light." The simple words bled with a promise too fragile to hold against the roaring tide of battle. It was the epitome of the human spirit, a defiant act of love against a backdrop of despair. As the sun climbed higher, the French advance seemed to gain momentum. The shock of the initial assault had given way to a cautious optimism. Communications improved as runners, despite being slowed by mud and fear, ran messages back and forth. The disciplined advance, in stark contrast to the disjointed British effort further north, began to reveal its promise. In some sectors, the French were not just holding ground. They were building it up, brick by brick, even if those bricks were moments of captured enemy positions and seized fortifications. However, the battlefield was never kind to optimism. With every foothold gained, the enemy adapted. German snipers relocated behind newly erected barricades. Machine gun nests, some thought neutralized by earlier bombardments, were quickly reactivated with fresh rounds. The French advance, though promising, was not a guarantee of victory. It was a temporary reprieve in a war measured in agony and attrition. Colonel Dubois, ever vigilant, ordered a pause. "Hold your positions," he commanded, his voice rising over the din of distant shelling. "Let the enemy come to us." It was a risky tactic, a moment to catch their breath and to allow newly arrived reserves to reinforce the fragile gains. But at that moment, it was their only chance to rest and regroup without being overrun by a swift counterattack. The pause was a double-edged sword. The soldiers, exhausted and muddied, formed a fragile line in the new ground they had captured. They knew the lull was temporary, that behind the enemy lines, waiting in the dark, a counterassault could come at any time. Every sound, a creak of wood, a distant footstep, even the sigh of the wind, carried the possibility of renewed death. In that brittle silence, thoughts raced through every mind. Would the Germans press their advantage? Would the French gains hold long enough to pave the way for a broader victory? And what price would the final breakthrough demand? Every man clutched his rifle as if it were the only thing keeping him tethered to life. Every breath was measured and heavy with uncertainty. Lieutenant Dupont, a young officer whose eyes betrayed both fear and fierce resolve, murmured to a fallen comrade, "We fight not for glory, but to live another day, for love, for home, for every dream we have yet to claim." His words resonated among the gathered men. The landscape bore the marks of both hope and horror. In some areas, rubble from collapsed bunkers had been cleared by desperate hands, creating makeshift ramparts. In others, trenches that once whispered with quiet despair now buzzed with the cautious optimism of a temporary victory. Mud churned again under the weight of marching boots, and barbed wire stood as a grim reminder of nature's cruelty made manifest through human hands. Yet as midday approached, the distant roar of enemy artillery hinted that this fragile advantage might soon be shattered. The French knew that the calm was not lasting, a lull before the storm. The German command, spurred by desperation and cunning, was likely marshaling reinforcements. The advance, so carefully built, could be swept away in an instant, as had happened so many times before on this cursed stretch of land. In the rear, French engineers worked feverishly, repairing damaged positions and preparing for further assaults. Crates of ammunition were moved through mud, trucks battered by shell impact, and medics worked without cease to patch up wounds that the battlefield inflicted in relentless waves. Every man, from the high-ranking officers to the lowliest private, understood that this small gain was a victory against overwhelming odds, a glimpse of what might be if only fortune smiled upon them long enough. And amidst the tension, a question hung like a specter over the captured ground. Could this advance hold? Or would the relentless tide of war wash it away, leaving nothing but the echoes of footsteps in the mud and the silence of lost souls? As twilight began its slow descent over the battered fields, the French soldiers braced themselves for what might come next. The rhythm of battle had shifted ever so slightly. A cautious optimism replaced despair, yet every heart beat in haunted fear of the enemy's return. Commander Dubois looked out over his newly claimed territory, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon where enemy artillery smoke mingled with the setting sun. His eyes, though tired, burned with the certainty that even in the midst of unending slaughter, moments of triumph, however fleeting, could rekindle hope. Then, in the fading light, a distant whistle sounded, sharp and clear, signaling an impending enemy counterattack. The silence that had so briefly embraced the French line shattered in that single note of warning. Soldiers gripped their rifles and gathered their resolve as they prepared for one more burst of violence that promised either to cement their hard-won gains or turn them into ashes. And as darkness crept over the Somme, the question lingered in every breath and heartbeat. Would the French advance endure, or would the night bring a flood of destruction that erased every inch of hope they had clawed from the cursed soil? The answer lay in the coming hour, hidden behind the smoke and echoes of war, a moment that would decide not only the fate of the southern sector, but the very shape of the battle, the Somme, and perhaps even the fate of a nation. Chapter 17, Skies over the Somme. The sky erupted in a sudden flash, machine guns rattling like thunder, engines roaring in a deadly chorus. Above the scarred earth of the Somme, a fierce dance unfolded, where life and death hung on the turning of fragile wings. A young pilot spiraled down, smoke trailing like a dark ribbon. His world shrank to a shattered cockpit, a last breath of hope fading into the gray clouds. This was the new war, the war in the sky. When the Battle of the Somme began in July of 1916, the air above was no longer empty. It had become a battleground, a wild arena where tiny, canvas-covered machines soared, dove, and clashed in dizzying combat. The Royal Flying Corps, the brave, daring airmen of Britain, had emerged as the eyes and guardians of the armies below. But this was far from the glamorous image many imagined. It was brutal, dangerous, and often unforgiving. These early airplanes were fragile, made of wood and fabric, with engines that coughed and wheezed. They flew at the mercy of the wind and enemy fire. Pilots sat exposed to bullets, rain, and freezing winds, gripping simple controls as they navigated invisible lines of danger. Yet they were pioneers, stepping into an unknown world where the sky became a new front. The primary mission was reconnaissance, seeing what no soldier on the ground could. Pilots flew low and slow over enemy lines, their cameras clicking relentlessly. They captured grainy, black-and-white images of trenches twisted like dark scars, artillery positions hidden beneath trees, and barbed wire laid thick like deadly fences. These photographs shaped strategies, saved lives, and sometimes sealed fates. Lieutenant James McAllister was one such pilot. Just 19, with eyes wide and nerves taut, he carried his camera high above the Somme's shattered fields. Each flight was a gamble. One false move, one burst of machine gun fire, and he would become a dark speck in the sky, gone forever. In letters home, he wrote of the strange beauty he saw from above, the delicate rivers weaving through mud, the ghostly outlines of destroyed villages, and the haunting cost beneath it all. But flying was not just about observation. Dogfights, intense aerial battles, became frequent. British biplanes, nimble but lightly armed, tangled with German Albatros fighters in the clouds. The roar of engines and the staccato of machine guns filled the air as pilots twisted and turned in a deadly ballet, fighting not just for survival, but for control of the skies. Whoever dominated the air had an advantage on the ground, spotting enemy movements and shielding their own troops. Captain Margaret Maggie Hayes was one of the few women who worked tirelessly behind the scenes, repairing engines and assembling planes in the muddy sheds near the front. She understood the stakes. Every part one fix, she said, could mean a man's life up there. For pilots, the line between life and death was razor thin. Without reliable aircraft, missions ended before they began. Communication was another challenge. Radios were bulky and unreliable, so pilots often relied on hand signals, dropped messages, or returning quickly to base. Carrier pigeons, carried in tiny baskets strapped to planes, sometimes brought vital news when all else failed. The fragility of technology made every flight a blend of skill, bravery, and luck. One September morning, McAllister's squadron spotted a German artillery battery moving under cover of dawn mist. With no time to lose, they flew low, dropping small bombs and strafing the area with machine gun fire. The attack delayed the German guns, allowing British infantry to advance with fewer casualties. It was a glimpse of air power's growing role, yet it came at a cost. McAllister's plane was hit, forcing a perilous landing behind enemy lines. Stories like his were common. Pilots faced the constant threat of death, mechanical failure, and the loneliness of the sky. Many never returned, their names etched in letters and memories far from the muddy fields below. As the months passed, aircraft improved. New models arrived with sturdier frames, synchronized guns firing through propellers, and better cameras. Squadrons grew, and aerial tactics evolved. Pilots trained relentlessly, learning to coordinate with ground troops, direct artillery fire, and provide cover. The sky became a crucial, if volatile, battlefield. But for all the technology and strategy, the human element remained. The young men who flew these planes were ordinary boys turned heroes, carrying fears, hopes, and dreams into the deadly blue. They wrote letters to loved ones, kept diaries, and whispered prayers before takeoff. The sky was their battleground, but also their isolation. By November 1916, after 4 months of relentless fighting on the ground, the Royal Flying Corps had flown thousands of sorties over the Somme. Their eyes had seen the horrors below. Their guns had defended the infantry. They had changed the face of warfare forever. Yet, as winter approached, the skies grew colder and more dangerous. Planes crashed in frozen fields. Pilots battled frostbite and exhaustion. And the war above the Somme continued, unseen but vital. The war in the sky had begun, not with grand victories, but with courage, trial, and the relentless will to fly. What the next chapter would bring was uncertain. But one thing was clear. The age of air power was born amidst the smoke, mud, and sacrifice of the Somme. And above all, the sky watched silently. Chapter 18. The first tanks roll in. The ground shook beneath their feet, a deep, rumbling roar unlike any artillery barrage or thunderclap. Soldiers paused, eyes wide, as strange iron beasts crawled forward through the shattered landscape of the Somme. Thick steel plates glistened in the morning sun, armored hulls clanking as tracks crushed the earth, swallowing barbed wire and shell craters alike. This was no ordinary war machine. This was the tank, a terrifying new weapon that promised to break the deadlock of trench warfare. But on September 15, 1916, when the first tanks clattered into battle near Flers-Courcelette, their promise was only just beginning, and their impact would be far more complicated than anyone imagined. For nearly 2 years, the Western Front had been a frozen stalemate. Trenches stretched for miles, trenches soaked in mud and blood. Soldiers died by the thousands for mere yards of land. Commanders searched desperately for a way to break through, a way to crush the enemy's defenses and open a path to victory. The tank was the answer born of innovation, secrecy, and sheer necessity. Its origins traced back to whispered discussions in British war rooms, engineers working feverishly in hidden workshops, and a desire to create a metal beast capable of crossing no man's land, a weapon that could shrug off bullets, flatten barbed wire, and punch through the maze of trenches. The name, tank, was deliberately chosen as a ruse to disguise its true purpose. And now, at the Somme, that secret was revealed to the world. The first tanks were crude by modern standards, lumbering hulks weighing around 23 tons, powered by noisy, sputtering engines. Their tracks were like wide steel belts, designed to carry them over craters, mud, and barbed wire. Painted a muddy brown, they looked like giant insects crawling across the battlefield. But inside, conditions were nightmarish. Crews of 3 men were packed into cramped, suffocating compartments, surrounded by clattering machinery, choking fumes, and blistering heat. Lieutenant Thomas Hart was one of those first tank commanders. He was a young man, barely 24, thrust into this new world of mechanized warfare with little warning. His voice quivered even years later as he recounted the day they rolled out onto the battlefield. It was like driving a beast from another world, he said. The earth trembled beneath us, and men stopped in their tracks, staring in disbelief at the monstrous machines. The enemy didn't know what to make of them. Some thought we'd unleashed walking fortresses. The tank's debut was dramatic. As they lumbered forward, they crushed tangled barbed wire underfoot, smashing through German defenses that had stopped countless infantry assaults. Machine guns struggled to track the slow, armored targets, and artillery shells often bounced harmlessly off their thick hulls. For a moment, the tanks seemed invincible, symbols of hope amid the endless carnage. British infantry, who had watched helplessly from the trenches for months, saw these iron beasts and dared to believe the stalemate might finally end. Soldiers whispered excitedly, "The tanks are coming. The war may change today." For the first time in years, the nightmare of mud and wire seemed to shift. But the reality was more brutal. Mechanical failures were rampant. The tank's engines overheated quickly in the stifling conditions, and the rough terrain of the Somme was unforgiving. Shell holes, mud pits, and shattered trees threatened to trap or topple the machines. Many tanks became stuck or broke down completely, leaving their crews vulnerable inside. The interior was deafening. The roar of the engine, the clatter of gears, and the rattle of enemy fire combined into a chaotic symphony of destruction. Lieutenant Hart described the horror of being trapped inside a burning tank. The heat was unbearable. Smoke filled the cabin. You could hear the enemy's bullets pinging off the steel, feel the ground shake with explosions. We were prisoners in a metal coffin. Crews were forced to abandon their vehicles, escaping into no man's land, where the risk of death was immediate. Some were captured, others lost in the tangled wasteland. The tanks, though revolutionary, were fragile, half marvel, half death trap. Despite these setbacks, the psychological effect was undeniable. The German defenders were shocked and fearful of the new weapon. Rumors spread of walking fortresses, invulnerable machines that could not be stopped. Soldiers found their confidence shaken. Some fled rather than face the advancing steel monsters. The tanks inspired hope among the British troops, but commanders knew that this was only the beginning. General Douglas Haig, commander of the British Expeditionary Force, saw enormous potential in the tanks. He ordered increased production and improvements, envisioning a future where mechanized forces could break the endless trench warfare stalemate. Yet, at the Somme, tanks remained few. Only about 40 made it to the battlefield that day, and their impact was limited. German troops adapted quickly, developing specialized anti-tank rifles and tactics to disable the machines. They learned to target the vulnerable tracks or wait for crews to abandon their disabled vehicles before destroying them. The soldiers on the ground experienced the tanks in very personal ways. Private William Jenkins wrote in his diary, "When the tank rumbled near, it was like a thunderstorm in a quiet forest. The enemy fired wildly, but the tank crushed their defenses. For a moment, hope bloomed, but then many tanks stopped or broke down, and men fell back into the mud and blood." Behind the scenes, mechanics and engineers worked tirelessly to improve the tanks. They sought better engines, stronger armor, and more reliable steering. Every failure was studied, every success celebrated. The war had entered a new phase, a test of human ingenuity as much as courage. As the sun dipped low on that September day, the battered tanks retreated or were abandoned, leaving behind twisted metal carcasses, a testament to the first clash between man and machine. The war would continue, muddy and bloody, but the tank had made its mark. Lieutenant Hart reflected later, "We were pioneers, stepping into the unknown." The tank was no savior yet, but it was a promise, a sign that the war was changing, that new weapons would shape the future. The rumble of tanks faded into the cold night, but the war machine was born. Its story was only beginning. Would it become the key to victory, or just another desperate gamble in a conflict that had already swallowed millions of lives? Only time would tell. And beneath the burning skies, the Somme waited for its next chapter. Chapter 19, The War Doctors. The battlefield was a hellscape. Shrapnel tore through flesh and bone. Cries of pain echoed above the distant thunder of artillery. Amidst the chaos, men lay wounded, bleeding in the mud, desperate for help that often felt impossibly far away. But behind the front lines, a quieter battle was unfolding, a battle fought not with guns and shells, but with skill, courage, and the will to save lives. This was the world of the war doctors, the stretcher bearers, and the nurses, the unseen heroes whose hands would shape the future of medicine amidst the blood and ruin of the Somme. On July 1st, 1916, the Somme offensive erupted with a force unlike any before. Over 1 million British and French soldiers marched forward into machine gun fire and shell craters, their hopes and fears intertwined in the smoke-filled air. In those first hours, tens of thousands fell, wounded or killed. For many, death was swift. For others, survival meant agony, and the desperate hope of reaching the medics waiting beyond the lines. Stretcher bearers were the first lifeline. Often young men themselves, Many barely older than the soldiers they helped carry, they braved the same dangers: gunfire, shells bursting nearby, and the ever-present mud that sucked at their boots. Their task was brutal: to find the wounded scattered across no man's land, lift them onto crude stretchers, and carry them back to field ambulances or dressing stations. Many worked for hours, their hands slick with blood, their faces stained with exhaustion. Theirs was a silent courage, visible only to those they saved. Private James Porter, a stretcher-bearer, wrote in a letter home, "I have carried men with shattered limbs and faces I will never forget." Some whispered last words, others begged simply for water. The mud clung to us as tightly as fear. But I could not stop. Every man I carried was a brother. Behind the front, field hospitals, makeshift clinics set up in barns, tents, or even caves, became sanctuaries for the wounded. Doctors and nurses worked around the clock, often in unbearable conditions: dim light, limited supplies, and the ever-present stench of infection. The noise was relentless: the groans of pain, the clatter of medical instruments, and the low murmur of prayers. Dr. Eleanor Sharp, one of the few women serving near the front, remembered the constant pressure. "We worked as if the world depended on us, because in a way, it did. Every life saved was a victory." The medical teams faced unprecedented challenges. The Somme's violence brought injuries unlike any before: deep wounds from exploding shells, shattered bones, burns from flamethrowers, and the invisible wounds of gas attacks. To treat these, doctors had to innovate quickly. One breakthrough was the use of triage, a method to prioritize treatment based on the severity of wounds. Unlike the past, when doctors treated soldiers in the order they arrived, triage meant saving those most likely to survive, even if it meant letting others wait or die. It was a harsh calculus born of necessity. Another advancement was the introduction of mobile X-ray units. These machines, bulky and delicate, allowed surgeons to locate bullets and shrapnel without invasive probing, reducing pain and infection. Though cumbersome, they were a game-changer on the battlefield. Blood transfusions also began to save lives, though the process was perilous. The science of matching blood types was still new, and errors could be fatal. Yet doctors persevered, developing techniques that would become the foundation of modern trauma care. Nurses played a critical role. Beyond medical skills, they offered comfort, a gentle touch, a reassuring word, amid the horror. Many were volunteers, driven by patriotism or compassion, and worked tirelessly despite the risks. Their presence reminded wounded soldiers that humanity endured even in war. Private Thomas Riley wrote, "In the darkest moments, it was the nurses' smiles that kept me alive." Despite these efforts, mortality rates were high. Infection was the deadliest enemy after the battlefield wounds. Without antibiotics, doctors used antiseptics and surgical cleanliness to combat gangrene and other diseases. Amputations were common, often the only way to stop the spread of infection, turning young men into lifelong survivors marked by loss. The war doctors themselves bore scars, physical and mental. The endless tide of suffering took a toll. Many suffered from what was then called shell shock, a condition we now understand as post-traumatic stress disorder. Yet they carried on, driven by duty and the knowledge that their work mattered. As the battle raged on, the lessons learned at the Somme would ripple through history. The advances in trauma care, surgical techniques, and emergency medicine laid the groundwork for modern military and civilian healthcare. And in quiet moments, far from the guns and mud, the war doctors pondered the cost. How many lives could have been saved with better preparation? How many families would grieve? These questions haunted them, even as they fought to heal. The story of the Somme is not only one of guns and blood, but of the courage of those who raced against death to save others. The war doctors were warriors of a different kind, armed with knowledge, compassion, and unyielding resolve. As night fell on the shattered fields, the medics prepared for the next wave. Because in war, the battle for life never ends. And beneath the endless sky, the Somme whispered its dark secrets, stories of suffering, sacrifice, and the flickering light of hope. The war doctors listened, ready to answer the call once more. Chapter 20: Shell Shock and Psychological Wounds. The battlefield was a storm of noise, chaos, and terror unlike anything the world had ever seen. The constant thunder of artillery shells ripping through the air, the screams of men, the acrid smoke that stung the eyes, all combined to create an unrelenting nightmare. Yet, beneath the visible destruction lay another, invisible front, a war inside the minds of the soldiers. This was the hidden battle of shell shock, psychological trauma, and the shattering of human spirit. On the Somme, where men faced horrors beyond imagining, countless soldiers found themselves breaking under the strain. Some collapsed in the mud, trembling uncontrollably. Others screamed, unable to speak, trapped in a fog of fear and confusion. These were not moments of weakness, but signs of a profound injury, a wound of the mind, inflicted by relentless bombardment and the horrors of war. The term shell shock was coined during World War I to describe this mysterious and terrifying condition. At first, doctors believed the symptoms were caused by physical damage to the brain from exploding shells, like invisible shrapnel lodged in the mind. But as cases multiplied, it became clear that the truth was far more complex. Private George Turner was one of the thousands sent to the Somme. A steady, reliable soldier before the battle, George began to change after weeks in the trenches. His letters home grew fragmented and filled with nightmares. His comrades found him frozen in fear during an artillery barrage, unable to move or speak. He was there, but not there, one friend recalled, like a ghost trapped inside his own body. The symptoms varied widely. Some men suffered trembling fits. Others lost all memory of recent events. Some could not control their breathing or heartbeat. Others were overcome by uncontrollable tears or rage. Doctors saw cases of mutism, paralysis, and even deafness with no physical cause. It was as if the mind itself was breaking under the weight of trauma. The relentless shelling on the Somme was unlike anything before. For days on end, soldiers endured explosions so powerful they shook the earth and shattered nerves. The constant fear of death, the sights of mangled bodies, the stench of decay, all eroded the mental defenses of even the strongest men. The trenches became prisons of anxiety and despair. Medical officers struggled to understand and treat shell shock. Some viewed it as cowardice or a failure of discipline, dangerous misunderstandings that led to harsh punishments. Others sought compassion, realizing that these psychological wounds were as real and debilitating as physical injuries. Captain Edward Langley, a British medical officer, described his frustration. "We saw brave men reduced to quivering wrecks by forces beyond their control. Yet our knowledge was limited, and sometimes our response was cruel." Early treatments ranged from rest and quiet to electric shocks and isolation, attempts to shock soldiers back to normalcy. These often failed or worsened conditions. The true challenge was that the mind's wounds could not be seen like broken bones, and stigma kept many suffering in silence. The psychological toll extended beyond individuals. Entire units were affected. The breakdown of morale, fear of death, and grief over lost comrades created a shared trauma that spread like wildfire. Soldiers formed tight bonds, but these also meant shared sorrow. Letters from the front reveal haunting glimpses. Private Samuel Hayes wrote, "Every night, I hear the shells and screams. I try to sleep, but my mind won't rest. I see faces of friends who died. Sometimes I wish to join them, for the pain is too much." The Army's response evolved slowly. Field hospitals began to include rest billets, where men could recover away from the front. Psychologists and psychiatrists were consulted to develop better understanding. Still, the stigma persisted, and many soldiers hid their suffering, afraid of shame or punishment. The war also exposed the limits of human endurance. The modern industrialized slaughter on the Somme pushed men beyond anything imaginable. The mental scars, often lifelong, were part of the legacy that haunted survivors long after the guns fell silent. The story of shell shock is one of both tragedy and awakening. It forced society to confront the fragile nature of the human mind under extreme stress and laid the groundwork for modern psychology and trauma care. Yet, questions remain. How many more lives were broken by wounds unseen? How did these silent battles shape the men who returned home, changed forever? As the Somme faded into history, the echoes of shell shock persisted, reminders that war's destruction goes far beyond the battlefield. And in the quiet moments, when the guns fall silent, the true cost of war whispers in the shattered minds of those who survived. Chapter 21: Press, Propaganda, and Public Perception. The thunder of artillery had barely faded when a different battle began, a battle fought not with guns and trenches, but with words and images, carried on newspapers, posters, and whispered conversations in drawing rooms and pubs. On July 1st, 1916, more than 60,000 British soldiers were killed or wounded in a single day, an unimaginable loss that shocked a nation. Yet, the morning papers that reached families across Britain spoke of courage, progress, and heroic advances. The brutal reality of shattered bodies and broken spirits was carefully masked by a veil woven from carefully chosen words and images. The story of the Somme was not told only on muddy fields soaked in blood. It was shaped thousands of miles away in offices, printing presses, and government halls. Here, the pen became a weapon as powerful as any rifle. Propaganda, the art of shaping perception, became essential. The British government and military understood that maintaining public morale was crucial for the war effort. A defeated spirit at home could mean fewer recruits, less money, and dwindling support. From the earliest days of the war, strict censorship was imposed. Newspapers were not allowed to print details that might reveal military weaknesses or demoralize the public. Letters from soldiers were routinely read by censors who erased any hint of despair or defeat. Reports were carefully framed to emphasize bravery and small victories, even when the reality was confusion and retreat. This filtering created a gulf between what families wanted to believe and what soldiers experienced. Young wives, mothers, and sweethearts clung to newspapers that promised hope, even as their loved ones fought in conditions worse than anyone at home could imagine. The clean, neat pages with bold headlines could not show the mud, the rats, the screams, or the stench of death. Journalists found themselves trapped in a moral and professional dilemma. Some tried to pierce through the fog of propaganda and report honestly on the horrors. Others, convinced that hope and national unity were vital, chose to echo official messages. The term war correspondent itself was new, and the role was fraught with tension between truth-telling and patriotism. One correspondent, Philip Gibbs, famously described the crushing weight of responsibility. He wrote of witnessing scenes of devastation beyond words, but knowing his reports would be shaped, or even censored, to maintain morale. His words carried the burden of balancing honesty and the expectations of a nation desperate for reassurance. The government's propaganda machine was relentless. Posters flooded cities, urging men to enlist with promises of honor and glory. Slogans such as, "Your country needs you," and "Lest we forget," echoed on walls and in newspapers, painting a picture of a noble cause. Songs and poetry celebrated these soldier boys, crafting heroes from young men who marched willingly into unimaginable carnage. But beneath this glossy narrative lurked a grim truth. The first day of the Somme was a catastrophe. Entire battalions, like the Newfoundland Regiment, were almost wiped out within minutes. Thousands of young men disappeared forever into mud and blood, their dreams and voices silenced. Private Arthur Davies wrote home in a letter that was later censored, "They tell us we are winning, but I see only dead friends and broken ground." The papers lie, or maybe they cannot understand what this place truly is. Families who received such letters were left confused and anxious. Some clung desperately to hope, while others confronted the slowly dawning truth that the war was far worse than the stories told in newspapers and official bulletins. This tension between truth and illusion created fractures in society. When official reports minimized losses or spoke only of modest gains, Those who lost loved ones felt betrayed. Rumors and whispers grew, challenging the official narrative. The British government also employed propaganda abroad. Allied nations used stories of heroism to inspire support and recruit soldiers. Meanwhile, enemy propaganda painted the Allies as brutal invaders, intensifying the psychological warfare beyond the battlefield. Artists and poets responded too. Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon, soldiers themselves, wrote poems that ripped through the veneer of patriotic myth, revealing the horror, futility, and grief of war. Their words would not reach a wide audience during the conflict, but after the war, they became vital voices of remembrance and truth. Back at home, newsreels showed soldiers marching proudly, cannon fire erupting in slow-motion glory. But the public could never fully grasp the mud-choked hell of the trenches, the endless waiting punctuated by moments of terror and despair. Censorship extended even to letters from the front. Soldiers' voices were often silenced or altered, their fear and hopelessness scrubbed away. This created a disconnect between the front lines and the home front, a distance not measured in miles, but in truth. The legacy of propaganda during the Somme shaped collective memory. Monuments and ceremonies celebrated courage and sacrifice, but often glossed over the senseless slaughter and suffering. The stories told helped bind a nation together, but sometimes obscured the full cost. The battle for public perception was a war in its own right, one fought in drawing rooms and newspapers' offices, in the hearts of families, and in the shadows of censorship. It was a war of hope and denial, of heroism and heartbreak. As history looks back, the challenge remains: how to honor the bravery and sacrifice without forgetting the full truth. For behind the words of glory lay millions of silent voices, buried beneath the mud and the carefully curated stories. The Somme teaches us that the stories we tell matter. They shape how we remember, how we mourn, and how we learn. And sometimes, the greatest courage lies in facing the darkest truths. Chapter 22: Final Offensives and Frozen Gains. The cold seeped into every bone, every breath, every heartbeat. The rain fell relentless, turning the shattered landscape into a quagmire of mud and misery. The sky was a dull, iron-gray ceiling pressing down on the exhausted men who crawled through the wreckage of what had once been vibrant fields and peaceful villages. It was the final stretch of the Somme, late autumn of 1916. The battle had dragged on for months, longer than anyone expected, costing more lives than anyone dared count. And still, the land barely shifted, a few shattered miles swallowed by the ceaseless grind of war. One morning, as dawn struggled to break through the fog, Lieutenant James McAllister clutched his soaked rifle and stared ahead at the enemy trenches, mere yards away yet seeming impossibly distant. His face was streaked with mud, eyes hollow from sleepless nights and unending shell fire. Around him, his comrades whispered prayers and grim jokes, small comforts against the overwhelming dread. They had fought through endless mud, bitter cold, and the constant threat of death, but the ground beneath their feet was soaked in sorrow and shattered dreams. The final offensives on the Somme were a test of human endurance as much as military strategy. The British and French armies pushed forward again and again, their hopes pinned on breaking the German lines and ending the stalemate. But the enemy was dug deep, fortified in bunkers and trenches carved into the earth like stone scars. Each advance was met with a hailstorm of bullets and shells. The rain turned the battlefield into a frozen wasteland, trapping men in mud so thick it swallowed boots and equipment. Disease, hunger, and exhaustion ravaged the ranks as surely as enemy fire. Captain Marie Dubois, a French nurse, wrote in her diary, "The men come to us broken in body and spirit, faces etched with cold and fear. We patch them up and send them back, but the lines barely move. It is a slow death, a battle of attrition that drains the soul." Despite the horrors, the soldiers held on. Orders came down relentlessly. Press forward, take that trench, hold that position. The commanders sought small victories, the frozen gains that might tip the war in their favor. Yet for every yard won, The cost was staggering. Thousands fell silent in the mud, their sacrifice marked only by shattered helmets and empty foxholes. The weather was as merciless as the enemy. Autumn rains soaked the ground until it was a slick morass of mud and blood. The cold crept into bones and minds alike, bringing numbness and despair. Trench foot, a disease caused by prolonged exposure to wet, cold conditions, claimed thousands, turning soldiers' feet black and useless. The constant shelling churned the earth, creating deep craters filled with icy water. Men slipped and sank, trapped by the very ground they fought to claim. Corporal William Harris wrote in a letter home, "It's not just the Germans we fear, it's the mud, the cold, the endless waiting. Every day is a struggle to keep moving forward, to keep holding on." The landscape itself seemed to fight back. Fields turned to wastelands. Trees were reduced to splintered stumps. Villages once filled with laughter were now rubble and ash. The no-man's land between the trenches was a deadly maze of barbed wire and shell holes, a frozen graveyard for thousands. In these final months, the battle had become a grim war of attrition, a test not only of military might but of willpower and endurance. The commanders hoped that relentless pressure would eventually break the enemy lines. But the cost was mounting, and the land itself seemed unwilling to surrender. Behind the front lines, reinforcements arrived weary and unprepared for the brutal reality. Many were young volunteers, filled with patriotic fervor but unready for the mud, blood, and ceaseless noise. Training could not prepare them for the frozen hell awaiting in the trenches. Amidst the chaos, moments of humanity flickered, a shared cigarette, a whispered prayer, a letter exchanged in secret. These brief escapes reminded men of life beyond the slaughter. But such moments were fragile, easily shattered by the whistle of an incoming shell. As November approached, the offensive slowed. The ground was soaked and frozen, the men exhausted beyond measure. The final attacks yielded some ground. A few battered villages retaken, some trenches secured. But the gains were limited, and the price was immense. Lieutenant McAllister wrote in his journal on November 3rd, "We have gained little, but lost so much. The men are ghosts of themselves. Still, we push on. For what? For hope? For duty?" The answer slips further away with every step. The Battle of the Somme would drag on for months more, but these final offensives marked the end of the Great Summer Push. The frozen gains were a bitter reminder of the war's true cost: lives lost, landscapes destroyed, and spirits broken. As winter tightened its grip, the shattered fields grew silent, save for the occasional crack of distant artillery. The Somme was forever changed, scarred by mud, blood, and the indomitable will of those who fought. The question remained: had the sacrifice been worth the frozen miles gained, or had the land swallowed too many dreams to ever answer? And as the guns faded into memory, the men who survived carried scars, seen and unseen, reminders that war's true cost goes beyond land or lines drawn in the dirt. It lives in the hearts of those who endured and in the land they left behind. Chapter 23. What was gained? July 1st, 1916, the first morning of the Battle of the Somme, remains etched in history as one of the bloodiest days the British Army has ever faced. 70,000 casualties in a single day, nearly 20,000 killed. The carnage was unfathomable, and the horror spread far beyond the muddy fields and shattered trenches of northern France. It reached into homes, communities, and the very soul of a nation. And yet, after months of relentless fighting, after almost 5 months of grinding war, what was truly gained? The Somme promised a breakthrough, a decisive strike that would break the stalemate on the Western Front, shatter German defenses, and turn the tide of the war. But when the guns finally fell silent, the battlefield told a different story. The front lines had shifted barely 7 miles. Entire villages lay in ruins. The earth was riddled with craters, soaked in blood and sacrifice. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were dead, wounded, or missing. The cost was staggering. But the strategic breakthrough, the grand victory, remained out of reach. General Douglas Haig, the British commander, believed in attrition. the idea that grinding down the enemy's manpower and resources would eventually force a German retreat. To him, the Somme was a necessary sacrifice, a long and costly battle that would weaken the enemy beyond recovery. And on some level, he was right. The German army suffered significant losses. By November, it was estimated that the Germans had lost over 500,000 men, killed, wounded, or captured, in what became one of the deadliest battles of the war. But numbers alone do not tell the whole story. For every German soldier lost, another took his place. The German army had prepared for a war of endurance, and their defensive tactics, deep bunkers, well-prepared machine gun nests, and the ruthless efficiency of their artillery made any advance painfully costly. The British and French struggled to break through fortified positions that had been reinforced for years. The Somme showed that modern warfare was no longer about swift victories or grand charges. It was a war of grinding attrition, where every inch gained was soaked in blood. On the Allied side, the battle was equally devastating. The British suffered over 400,000 casualties, including 60,000 dead. The French, fighting alongside their British allies in the southern sectors, endured around 200,000 casualties. These numbers represented not just statistics, but shattered families, broken communities, and lost futures. The land itself paid a heavy price. The once fertile fields were transformed into a moonscape of craters and mud, where barbed wire hung like twisted vines over shattered trees and destroyed homes. The Somme was no longer just a battlefield. It was a scar on the face of Europe. Yet, despite the high cost and limited territorial gains, the battle had some lasting impacts. It forced military leaders on all sides to rethink their strategies. The horrors of the Somme accelerated the development of new tactics, technologies, and approaches to warfare. Tanks made their debut in September 1916, clumsy but promising machines that would later revolutionize battlefields. Air reconnaissance and coordination between infantry, artillery, and air forces improved, laying the groundwork for future combined arms tactics. Moreover, the battle tested the resilience and resolve of millions of soldiers. Young men from Britain, France, Canada, Australia, and beyond, who endured unimaginable conditions. Their courage and sacrifice became a symbol of endurance and national identity for many countries involved. But what of the promised breakthrough? Why did the Somme fail to deliver the decisive victory its planners envisioned? One reason lay in the overconfidence of the commanders. The belief that a prolonged artillery bombardment would destroy German defenses proved tragically mistaken. The bombardment often failed to cut barbed wire or destroy deep bunkers. Many German troops survived underground, ready to unleash devastating machine gun fire once the barrage lifted. Communication challenges further hindered the offensive. Soldiers advancing across no man's land struggled to coordinate with artillery support or reinforcements. The fog of war, combined with difficult terrain and relentless enemy fire, slowed progress to a crawl. Additionally, the sheer scale of the battle, involving millions of men over a wide front, made rapid advances difficult. The war was no longer about swift movement but grinding, exhausting engagements that pushed men and machines to their limits. In many ways, the Somme exposed the brutal reality of industrialized warfare. It shattered illusions of glorious victories and revealed the deadly effectiveness of modern weapons. It was a crucible that tested human endurance against the mechanical forces of destruction. For families back home, the Somme became a source of grief and pride. Memorials were erected to honor the fallen, and stories of bravery became part of national narratives. Yet, many questioned the value of the sacrifice. Was the ground gained worth the lives lost? Could better planning or different tactics have saved thousands? Historians continue to debate these questions a century later. Some view the Somme as a tragic but necessary battle that contributed to the eventual Allied victory. Others see it as a devastating example of poor leadership and the horrors of a war that demanded too much from too many. In the end, the Somme stands as a testament to the complexity of war, where courage and tragedy intertwine, where victory and loss exist side by side. It reminds us that the price of war is measured not only in land taken or battles won, but in the human cost paid by countless soldiers and civilians. As the guns fell silent and the battlefields grew quiet, the world was forever changed. The Somme was a frozen moment in history, a brutal chapter of sacrifice and struggle whose echoes continue to shape our understanding of war, humanity, and memory. And as the years pass, the question remains, what was truly gained at the Somme? The answer is as complex as the battle itself, a mixture of loss, endurance, change, and the haunting cost of war. Chapter 24, Counting the Cost. The mud still clings to the boots of the fallen. The rain washes over shattered earth, mingling with blood soaked deep into the soil. Over 1 million casualties, dead, wounded, missing, etched into the history of the Battle of the Somme. A number so vast, it becomes almost impossible to grasp. It's more than a statistic. It is a human tragedy beyond words, a silent testament to lives interrupted, futures erased, and families left forever mourning. Imagine a morning in late July, 1916. Thousands of young men, barely out of childhood, march toward the front lines with hope in their hearts and fear behind their eyes. Some carry letters from home, others hold on to dreams of glory, yet all are unaware that many will never return. The Somme would become a relentless machine, grinding, consuming, and scattering bodies across fields that once bloomed with wheat and wildflowers. The cost was staggering. Over 400,000 British casualties. Nearly 200,000 French soldiers wounded or killed. The Germans too bled heavily, with losses estimated above 500,000. These numbers, when spoken aloud, sound abstract. But behind every figure is a story, a father, a son, a brother, a friend. Men who laughed, loved, and dreamed before the war turned their world upside down. The ground itself tells the story of sacrifice. Craters the size of houses pockmark the landscape, filled with rainwater and memories. Barbed wire, twisted and rusted, hangs like skeletal remains of what once was a living world. Villages were erased, farms flattened. The land, once fertile and green, transformed into a barren wasteland, a graveyard without name or marker for so many. Yet, the dead of the Somme do not rest quietly beneath the soil. Thousands were buried hastily in shallow graves, their bodies lost to time and war. The roar of artillery and the chaos of battle often made it impossible to retrieve the fallen. Many remain missing to this day, their names etched on memorials instead of gravestones, their stories told only by letters and whispered memories. Cemeteries, large and small, scatter the Somme region. Rows upon rows of white crosses and headstones stretch as far as the eye can see, a stark reminder of the price paid. Each marker represents a life lost, a family left in mourning. These sites have become places of pilgrimage, where descendants and strangers alike come to remember, to grieve, and to reflect on the futility of war. Among the most poignant is the Thiepval Memorial, dedicated to over 70,000 missing British and South African soldiers who have no known grave. Walking through its solemn arches, one cannot help but feel the weight of absence, the echo of millions who vanished into the chaos. But beyond the physical scars on the landscape lie deeper wounds, those etched into the minds and hearts of survivors. Men returned from the Somme forever changed. Some carried broken bodies, many more carried broken souls. The trauma of endless shelling, the sight of friends torn apart, and the relentless fear left invisible marks that time struggled to heal. Families received telegrams, sometimes merely bearing the words "killed in action" or "missing believed dead." The agony of waiting, not knowing the fate of a loved one, haunted countless households. Mothers clung to hope. Children grew up with empty chairs at the dinner table. Entire communities mourned together, bound by shared loss. The battle also exposed the brutal reality of modern industrial warfare, where machines and technology turn men into expendable parts of a larger, unforgiving system. The Somme shattered illusions of glory and honor, replacing them with a sobering truth. War demanded a price measured in human suffering on a scale never before seen. In the years after the war, memorials rose across the Allied nations, in Britain, Canada, Australia, and France, as silent witnesses to sacrifice. Poems were written, songs composed, and stories told to keep alive the memory of those who fought and died. The Battle of the Somme entered national consciousness not just as a military event, but as a symbol of endurance, loss, and the search for meaning amid chaos. Yet, the scars remain. The fields of the Somme still yield the occasional relic, a rusted helmet, a forgotten shell, bones disturbed by plowing. The ground, even a century later, remembers. It whispers stories of courage and despair, of young men who faced death with resolve and fear. Today, as visitors walk the quiet trails where once roared the guns, there is a solemn understanding that the cost of the Somme goes far beyond land gained or lost. It is measured in lives forever changed, in families marked by grief, and in the haunting silence left by those who never came home. As the world reflects on this chapter of history, the question lingers: how do we honor the memory of such sacrifice? How do we ensure that the cost of the Somme teaches us the value of peace and the preciousness of human life? The answers may never be simple, but in remembering, in counting the cost, we pay tribute not only to the fallen, but to the resilience of humanity itself. The Somme, with all its devastation, challenges us to carry forward the lessons of the past and strive for a future where such a price is never paid again. And so, the story continues, in the echoes of the trenches, in the silent rows of cemeteries, and in the hearts of all who remember. Chapter 25, Legacy of the Somme. July 1st, 1916, the day the sun rose over the fields of northern France, marking the beginning of the Battle of the Somme. 70,000 British casualties in a single day. The bloodiest morning in the history of the British Army. Yet, the story of the Somme does not end with its staggering death toll or the shattered earth it left behind. Instead, it lives on, deeply woven into the fabric of Britain's collective memory, reshaping not only military history, but also how the world understands the brutal nature of modern warfare. The Somme was more than a battle. It was a crucible, forging a new chapter in the story of war, sacrifice, and national identity. For Britain, it became a defining moment, a place where the youthful optimism of an empire met the harsh, grinding reality of industrialized conflict. It tested the limits of courage, endurance, and leadership, and left an indelible mark on generations to come. At the heart of the Somme's legacy lies its human cost. Over 1 million men killed, wounded, or missing. This staggering figure is more than a number. It is a mosaic of lives interrupted, sons, fathers, brothers who marched off with dreams of glory, only to confront the terrifying face of modern war. Letters sent home speak of hope and fear, of camaraderie and loss. Diaries reveal the daily struggle to hold on to humanity amid the mud, blood, and shellfire. These voices carry the weight of the battle beyond statistics, reminding us that behind every casualty was a story worth telling. The impact of the Somme on British society was profound. Entire communities were shattered. Towns lost their young men, schools lost their students, families lost their future. The war was no longer distant, it was personal. Memorials began to rise, from the towering Thiepval Memorial to humble village plaques, each a testament to sacrifice and remembrance. Annual commemorations, poems, and stories kept alive the memory of those who gave everything on those scarred fields. But the legacy of the Somme reaches beyond remembrance. It forced a reckoning in military strategy and understanding. The battle exposed the limitations of traditional tactics against the deadly efficiency of machine guns, artillery, and barbed wire. The failure of the prolonged artillery bombardment to destroy German defenses revealed the deadly resilience of trench warfare. Commanders learned hard lessons about the coordination of infantry, artillery, and emerging technologies like tanks and aircraft. The Somme became a harsh classroom, teaching generals and soldiers alike that war had changed forever. The idea of swift, glorious victories was replaced by the grim reality of attrition and endurance. It underscored the necessity for innovation, new weapons, new tactics, and better communication. The lessons learned at the Somme influenced every major battle that followed, shaping the conduct of warfare for decades. Yet, with this new understanding came controversy. The role of leaders like General Douglas Haig remains fiercely debated. Was he a visionary, steering a vast army through impossible odds toward eventual victory? Or was he a butcher, blindly sacrificing thousands for questionable gains? These debates persist, reflecting the complex and often painful truth about the cost of command and the fog of war. The Somme also changed how Britain and the world perceived the individual soldier. The anonymous masses of earlier conflicts became real, human faces with names, stories, and dreams. The PALS battalions, formed from friends and neighbors, brought the war home in a way that statistics never could. Their devastating losses taught society the tragic consequences of collective sacrifice, forever changing recruitment, training, and care for soldiers. In literature and art, the Somme inspired a powerful wave of expression. Poets like Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon gave voice to the horrors they witnessed, their words piercing the veil of patriotic myth to reveal the raw anguish beneath. Paintings and photographs captured the devastation, ensuring that the image of the Somme endured not just in memory, but in culture. Across the Commonwealth, the battle forged a shared sense of identity and sacrifice. Canadian, Australian, New Zealand, and South African troops fought alongside British soldiers, their bravery and losses becoming foundational to their national histories. The Somme was a global event, binding distant lands in a shared narrative of endurance and loss. The physical scars of the Somme endure as well. The landscape still bears the pockmarks of artillery craters, the remnants of trenches, and the echoes of barbed wire. Archaeologists and historians continue to uncover relics, keeping the memory alive and reminding us that history is not buried but layered beneath our feet. In schools, in ceremonies, in families, the story of the Somme is told and retold, a somber reminder of the price of war and the resilience of the human spirit. It challenges new generations to remember not only the sacrifice but the need for peace. To understand that behind every strategic decision lie lives forever changed. The Somme's legacy is also a warning. It speaks of the dangers of hubris in leadership, the cost of misjudgment, and the importance of compassion amid conflict. It calls on us to recognize the humanity in every soldier, every civilian caught in the crossfire. As the sun sets over the Somme battlefield today, the silence is heavy with history. The grass grows over trenches once filled with fear. The wind carries whispers of voices long gone, but not forgotten. The legacy of the Somme is etched not only in stone and soil, but in the hearts and minds of those who strive to understand the past, so that the lessons of sacrifice, courage, and loss might guide the future. And so, the story of the Somme endures, a tale of tragedy and hope, of war's brutal cost, and the enduring quest for peace. It is a legacy that challenges us still, a question that remains. How do we honor the past while forging a better tomorrow? The answer lies, perhaps, in remembrance, reflection, and the unwavering commitment to never forget.